There are 10 battles that were fought over this planet before recorded history began, and one of them has never officially ended. That last part is what most people cannot bring themselves to accept, because if it is true, then everything we call ancient history is really just the quiet years between engagements, and the engagement is still open. The paperwork was never signed. The armies were never demobilized. The weapons were never accounted for. They were only hidden, buried, sealed under stone and salt and ice, waiting. The Sumerians knew about all 10. They wrote them down in an order, and the order matters because each battle was a consequence of the one before it. You cannot understand the second without the first. You cannot understand the 10th without the 9th. And you cannot understand why this planet keeps producing the same patterns, the same collapses, the same catastrophic resets every few thousand years, without reading the sequence from beginning to end. The Sumerians did not present these as myths. They presented them as records, numbered, dated in their own reckoning, attributed to specific commanders and specific casualties and specific weapons whose descriptions match nothing that should have existed at the time. For the next 3 hours, you are going to hear all 10 in order. You will hear who fought. You will hear what they fought with. You will hear who won and who lost and who withdrew and who was erased from the record so completely that only fragments of their names survived. You will hear about the war that split the sky. You will hear about the weapon that was used once and then forbidden. You will hear about the underground siege that lasted so long the attackers became a different species by the time it ended. You will hear about the alliance that broke over a woman, and the alliance that broke over a mine, and the alliance that broke over a decision about what to do with the humans who kept surviving every attempt to erase them. And you will hear about the 10th, the one that never officially ended, the one whose commanders are, according to the tablets, still on this planet, still positioned, still waiting for a countdown that started before the first pyramid was cut and has not stopped ticking since. If you want to know why the ground under certain places is radioactive without any nuclear history in the human record, this is why. If you want to know why certain sites are sealed and guarded and the guards do not know what they are guarding, this is why. If you want to know why every ancient civilization from Sumer to Egypt to India to Central America describes the same sky battle in almost the same language, this is why. They were all remembering the same war. They were remembering it from 10 different angles, 10 different survivor lineages, 10 different fragments of a record system that used to be one document and got broken into pieces when the losers of the last battle went underground. That record system is what we are going to reconstruct tonight, not as speculation, as sequence. Battle 1, cause. Battle 2, consequence. Battle 3, escalation. And so on, all the way to Battle 10, which is not a memory, which is not a legend, which is happening right now in the sense that the terms of it have never been changed and the actors have never left the field. So settle in, turn the lights down, let the sequence run in the order it was meant to run, and when we get to the 10th battle, and I tell you that it is not over, I want you to already understand why. Because by then you will have heard the other 9, and you will see the pattern for yourself, and the pattern will explain the world you are living in a way that nothing else does. This is the record of the 10 battles fought over Earth. Read in order. The 10th one is still open. Battle 1, the First Sky War. The Sumerian scribes did not begin their record of the 10 battles with a fight on the ground. They began it with a fight in the sky, because the sky is where the first fracture happened, and everything on the ground afterward was only the settlement of that fracture. To understand what they meant by sky, you have to unlearn something first. When the tablets say heaven, they do not mean an abstract paradise. They mean a specific place, a body, an installation that hung above the planet in the years before the deluge, close enough that its lights could be seen from the plains of Mesopotamia, and its comings and goings could be marked on the horizon. The scribes called it Eanna, the house of An, the seat of the highest command, and it was over the possession of that house that the first battle was fought. Before the battle, there was a family. That is how the scribes described it. Not a government, not an army, a family. And like all families that hold too much power for too long, this one carried inside it the two things that would eventually split it apart. The first was inheritance. The second was ambition. An was the father. He held the highest position, and he held it from a place that was, according to the tablets, not on the surface of the earth. He held it from the sky. From Eanna, from the installation whose lights the humans below sometimes mistook for stars, but which the scribes knew were not stars because they moved when stars did not, and they held station when stars did not, and they occasionally descended and rose again in ways that no fixed object in the heavens could account for. Below An, there were two suns. The elder was Enlil, whose name the scribes rendered as Lord of the Command, or Lord of the Breath, depending on the tablet. Enlil was the field commander. He was the one who administered the surface of the planet. He held the atmosphere. He held the winds. He held the authority to declare weather, which in the older sense meant he held the authority to declare when a region would live and when a region would die. Below Enlil, there was Enki, the second son. And here the scribes are precise in a way that matters. Enki was born of a different mother than Enlil, and this difference of mother is not a footnote in the record. It is the fault line along which the first battle would eventually crack open. Enki was the engineer. He was the one who understood the machinery of the planet. He held the fresh waters, which in the older cosmology meant he held the aquifers, the springs, the deep reservoirs beneath the crust. He held the mines. He held the fabrication of tools. And he held, according to several of the older tablets, the intellectual work of shaping life itself. The scribes are careful about this. They do not say Enki created humans in the way a god creates. They say Enki designed humans. He worked with a female engineer, whose name is given variously as Ninhursag or Ninti or Nintu, and together they modified an existing hominid stock to produce a worker capable of taking over the labor that the lower ranks of the family had, up to that point, been forced to perform themselves. That labor was mining. Specifically, the mining of a substance that the tablets call gold, but which some interpreters have argued was a broader class of heavy metals used for atmospheric repair on the homeworld. The reason for this interpretation is that the quantities described are impossibly large for ornamental use, and the deployment described is not ornamental. It is atmospheric. The refined material was carried up to Eanna in shuttles, and from Eanna it was carried further, to a destination the tablets simply refer to as the home. But that is a topic for Battle 3, when we get to the underground siege. For now, what matters is that Enki was the engineer, Enlil was the commander, and the two of them did not agree on what the humans they had made were for. Enlil believed the humans were a workforce and nothing more. He believed they should mine, and beyond mining they had no purpose, and beyond a certain population size they became a liability. Enki believed something different. Enki believed the humans, having been made in the image of the makers, carried something of the makers inside them. Not just genes, though the genes mattered, something else. Something the tablets call the me, and which is one of the most difficult words in the entire Sumerian vocabulary to translate. The me was, roughly, the operating system. It was the set of principles and knowledge and rights that the family carried, and Enki believed that a portion of the me had been passed to the humans in the act of making them, and that this passage could not be revoked. This disagreement is the seed of the first battle. But it is not yet the battle. The battle came when the disagreement about the humans intersected with a much older disagreement about inheritance, because Enlil was the elder son by birth order, but Enki was the elder son by lineage of the mother. And in the family's own succession law, the mother's lineage counted for as much as the birth order, sometimes more. Which meant that when Anne eventually withdrew from active command, there was no clean answer to the question of who inherited Eanna. Both brothers had a claim. Both brothers knew it. And both brothers had spent centuries building the followings that would back their claim when the time came. The tablets do not tell us who moved first. The tablets, in fact, are careful not to assign the first move. What they say is that a signal was sent from the surface up to Eanna, and the signal was misread, and a response was launched, and the response was interpreted as an act of war, and by the time anyone tried to stop it, the counter-response had already been launched. It is the oldest description of a war that started by mistake. And it is chilling in the way that all such descriptions are chilling, because the machinery to escalate was already in place, and once the machinery was in motion, no single voice could halt it. The first exchange happened at altitude. The tablets describe lights that split the sky, and beams that crossed the sky and did not curve, and sounds that came from above and were felt in the ground before they were heard in the ear. They describe the great house shaking in its station. They describe pieces of it falling. They describe fires that burned in the upper air, and did not go out because there was no air up there to stop them, only vacuum, and the fires kept burning through their own fuel until the fuel was spent. What the scribes are describing, if you strip the poetic language away, is an engagement between orbital platforms using directed energy weapons. That is not my interpretation. That is the plain reading of what the tablets say, once you allow yourself to read them plainly. The engagement did not last long in the way we measure fighting. The tablets say it lasted 7 days, but the Sumerian day was not our day, and the 7 in this context is a formula the scribes used for a completed cycle. What matters is that when the engagement ended, Eanna had been damaged, but it had not fallen. The house of An was still in the sky, still holding station, still under the technical authority of An himself, who had emerged from his own quarters during the engagement and had, according to one of the older tablets, personally issued the order to stop. He was still the father. His voice still carried the highest weight. And when he ordered the fighting to end, it ended. But it did not end in the sense of resolution. It ended in the sense of pause. Because the underlying question, who inherits when, and steps down, had not been answered. It had only been shelved. And the two brothers, Enlil and Enki, had now taken the measure of each other's willingness to escalate, and they had both concluded, correctly, that the other one was prepared to go further than they had previously believed. This is the darkest lesson of the first battle, and it is a lesson that will echo through the next 9. Once you have shown an opponent what you are willing to do, you have redefined the range of what they are willing to do in return, and called a council. The tablets describe it in some detail. It was held not in Eanna, which was still damaged and only partially operational, but in a location the scribes call the Great Below, which most interpreters now agree was an installation at the equator, on the surface of the earth, built into a mountain range that was, at that time, still forming. The council included An, Enlil, Enki, their sister Ninhursag, and a set of subordinate commanders whose names appear in the record, and then, mostly, disappear. The purpose of the council was not to declare a winner. The purpose was to divide the planet. If the two brothers could not share the sky, they would each be given a portion of the ground, and the sky would be neutralized between them. The division, as the tablets describe it, was not equal, and it was not fair, and both brothers understood it was a temporary measure that satisfied neither of them. Enlil was given the northern regions, the highlands, the mountain-fed rivers, the atmospheric zones where his authority over wind and weather could be exercised directly. Enki was given the southern regions, the marshlands, the Abzu, which meant the watery deep, which meant everything below the surface, which meant the mines, the aquifers, the sea. To Ninhursag was given the middle band, the equatorial land where the humans had first been made, and where the primary population still resided. To An was reserved Eanna itself, and the sky, and the right to overrule any of the three below him. This was called the First Division, and it held, for a time. It held long enough for cities to be built. It held long enough for the humans, who had proliferated during the years of the Sky War and continued to proliferate afterward, to establish something the scribes called kingship. Kingship was not, in the Sumerian understanding, a human invention. It was a technology that had been transferred, or perhaps loaned, from the family above. It was a way of organizing large numbers of humans into a functioning administrative unit, and it was given first to the city of Eridu, in the south, in Enki's territory, because Enki was the one who advocated for the transfer, and Enlil was the one who resisted. You can see, already, the shape of the second battle forming. Enlil resisted the transfer of kingship. Enki insisted on it. And when kingship was transferred to Eridu anyway, Enlil considered this a violation of the First Division, and he began preparations to answer that violation in the only way the family knew how to answer violations, which was with a weapon and a demonstration and a message that could not be misunderstood. But we are not yet at Battle 2. We are still at Battle 1, and Battle 1 has one more chapter, which is the chapter of the aftermath. And it is in the aftermath that the seeds of everything that follows are planted. The aftermath of the First Sky War was a period the scribes called the Long Peace, though it was not a peace in the sense we would use the word. It was more like a truce. The weapons that had been used above the atmosphere were locked away, held in the custody of Na personally, and their release was made subject to a council vote of the family. This was, in effect, the first arms control treaty on this planet, and it was made not between two human nations, but between the two branches of a non-human family, and the weapons it locked away were not conventional. The tablets, in their oblique way, refer to these weapons as the seven that split, and the descriptions of them are consistent enough across different traditions that we can be fairly confident we are looking at the same class of device each time. What that device did, and why it was called the Seven, we will come to when we reach Battle 5. During the Long Peace, the family expanded. Sons were born to Enlil, sons were born to Enki, daughters were born to both, and to Ninhursag, and the second generation began to take up regional commands under their fathers. Enlil's eldest son was Nanna, whose portfolio was the moon, which in the older cosmology meant the calendar, which in the older cosmology meant the schedule of everything. If you controlled the calendar, you controlled when the mines opened and when the rivers were expected to rise, and when the humans were expected to plant and harvest. Nana was, in effect, the family's chief of timing. Below him were his own two children, Utu and Inanna, the twins. Utu was given the sun, meaning the day cycle, meaning the enforcement of law during the daylight hours. Inanna was given something more complicated, which the scribes struggled to define, and which most modern interpreters now translate as the domain of transformation. Inanna could move between the categories. She could enter the realm of the dead and return. She could carry authority from one region into another. And she would, eventually, become one of the central figures in battles 6 through 8. Enki, for his part, had sons of his own. Marduk was the eldest, and Marduk's ambition was of a different order than any of his cousins on the Enlil side. Marduk did not want to administer a region. Marduk wanted the highest seat. He wanted Anna itself, once An eventually withdrew, and he began to build his following on the argument that the first division had been unjust, that his father Enki was the rightful successor, and that when his father inherited, he, Marduk, would inherit after. This was the argument that would, 3 battles from now, break the family apart for a second time and produce the war whose radioactive signature is still detectable in the sand of certain parts of the Middle East to this day. But we are getting ahead. Back to the First Sky War and its aftermath. The aftermath produced, alongside the long peace, a record system. This is important because the record system is what we are reading from now. The family understood that if they were going to maintain a truce for an extended period, they needed to write down what had happened, what had been agreed, and what the terms were. They needed a document, and the document they produced was not, at first, a religious text. It was an administrative record. It was kept in Anna, and copies of it were distributed to the regional command centers, and the regional command centers copied it further, and eventually, when the humans below were taught to read and write, they were given portions of the document to keep in the temples of their cities. Those portions are what survive. Those portions, fragmented and reordered, and sometimes corrupted, are what we call the Sumerian corpus. The reason this matters is that when the scribes wrote about the First Sky War, they were not writing legend. They were transcribing a portion of the family's own record. The names, the dates, the sequence, all of it comes from a source document that the humans did not invent. They inherited it. They preserved it. And when we read it now, we are reading a summary, in the humans' own words, of a family memo that was written before the humans existed. That is a strange thought, but it is the only thought that accounts for the internal consistency of the material. If the Sumerian scribes had invented these stories, the stories would contradict each other in the ways that invented stories always contradict each other. They do not. They line up. They line up so precisely that scholars have spent 150 years trying to explain the alignment, and no theory that treats the material as pure invention has managed to explain it fully. So we begin, as the scribes began, with the First Sky War. 2 brothers, one installation in the sky, one father who could barely stop them in time, a truce that everyone knew was temporary, a weapons class locked away, and a record system that would carry the memory of what had happened forward through every generation, human and otherwise, that came after. That is Battle 1. That is the fracture from which everything else follows. And now, before we move to Battle 2, there is something I need to tell you. The tablets that describe Battle 1 do not exist as a single continuous document. They exist as pieces. Some of the pieces are in the British Museum, some are in Berlin, some are in Baghdad, or were before the museum there was looted, and some of those pieces have not been seen since. Some are in private collections whose owners will not permit them to be photographed. And some, according to the researchers who have looked longest at this material, are still in the ground, still under the soil of what used to be southern Iraq, still under the rubble of temples that were burned 3,000 years ago and never fully excavated. The record is incomplete, and it is incomplete on purpose, because at various points in the history of this planet, someone has made a decision that this record should not be reassembled by the humans currently living on the surface. Every time the record almost gets reassembled, something happens. A library burns. A museum is looted. A tablet cracks in transit, and the crack runs exactly through the passage that would have connected 2 previously unconnected texts. This has happened often enough that even the driest scholars, the ones who would never allow themselves to say the word conspiracy in print, have begun to note in their footnotes that the pattern of losses is statistically unusual. The pattern of losses is statistically unusual. That is the phrase they use. When you translate it out of academic language, what it means is that someone does not want you to be able to read the full sequence. Which brings me to what I need to tell you before we go on to Battle 2. Quick pause. And this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. The 7 resets. Every reset matched against the 10 battle sequence you are hearing tonight, and the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. Back to the video. Now, Battle 2. Because to understand Battle 2, you have to understand what happened in the space between the truce and the next escalation. You have to understand that the long peace was not silent. During the long peace, the family kept building. Enki kept refining his humans. Enlil kept fortifying his highlands. Marduk kept growing his following. And beneath all of it, the humans themselves, the workers, the mine crews, the city dwellers, kept doing something that neither Enlil nor Enki had fully anticipated. The humans kept becoming more than they had been designed to be. They kept becoming smarter. They kept becoming more capable. They kept, in ways that both alarmed and interested the family, kept remembering things. Remembering the war. Remembering the lights in the sky. Passing the memory down. Turning it into song. Into ritual. Into a body of knowledge that was, from the family's perspective, unauthorized. The humans had not been given the me. The humans had been given the workload, and a limited grant of instructions sufficient to perform the workload, and beyond that they had been told nothing. And yet the humans, on their own, without transfer or permission, had begun to reconstruct something that resembled the me, piece by piece, generation by generation, in the songs of the elders, in the diagrams the children drew in the mud, in the observations the fishermen made about the movements of the lights above. This was the deepest cause of the second battle, not the weapon, not the city, not the transfer of kingship. Those were the surface causes. The deep cause was that the humans, whom Enlil had wanted to keep as workers and Enki had wanted to develop as inheritors, had started developing themselves, without waiting for either brother's decision. And that put both brothers, though from opposite directions, into a position they had not planned for. Enlil now had to consider whether the humans would need to be culled, not once, but repeatedly, to keep them at the level of workers. And Enki now had to consider whether the humans, having begun to develop on their own, could be steered, or whether they would eventually develop in a direction neither he nor his brother approved of. The answer, which the tablets do not state directly but which the sequence of events makes obvious, is that the humans could not be fully steered. They could be nudged, they could be disrupted, they could be, at enormous cost, reset. But they could not be steered. Once the me had begun to leak into the human line, whether by design or by accident or by the human's own theft of it, the direction of human development was no longer under family control. And that fact, more than any single tactical decision, is what drove the next 9 battles. The rest of the record is, in a very real sense, a record of the family trying to figure out what to do about a species that would not stop developing. Battle 2. The weapon over Eridu. If the first battle was a fight over the sky, the second battle was a fight over the ground, specifically over a single city, Eridu, the first of the human cities, the one that, according to the tablets, received kingship before any other place, and whose founding is described not as a human enterprise but as an act of Enki personally. Enki laid out the city. Enki dug the first canal. Enki built the first temple, and the first temple was not a temple in the religious sense. It was an administrative building. It was where the humans came to receive their instructions, and where they came to record what they had done, and where the family's local commander could keep his eye on the workforce without having to descend all the way into the marshes. Eridu sat on the edge of what was then a bay of the Persian Gulf. The sea has retreated since. The site is now well inland, buried under a mound that has been partially excavated, but never fully. What has been excavated is enough to confirm that Eridu is the oldest continuously occupied site in Mesopotamia. What has not been excavated is what lies beneath the deepest layer, and every attempt to dig deeper than the deepest layer has been abandoned, sometimes because of funding, sometimes because of politics, and sometimes because the diggers have run into obstacles that they will not describe on the record. But we are not concerned with the modern archaeology of Eridu tonight. We are concerned with what happened above it, in the sky, during the period the tablets call the Second Age. During the Second Age, kingship had been transferred to Eridu. Humans were multiplying in the surrounding regions. The workforce was expanding, and with the workforce expanding, the amount of material being moved out of the southern mines and up to the resupply depots was expanding along with it. Enki, from his seat in Eridu, was administering all of this. He was doing it well, by every measure the tablets record. Production was up, discontent was low, The humans were being managed with a lighter hand than Enlil had wanted, but the results were producing more output, not less, which was the argument Enki had made all along. The problem was Enlil. Enlil, from his own seat in the northern city of Nippur, watched Eridu grow with an increasing sense of alarm. It was not, on the surface, a jealousy about the city itself. Nippur was, in some ways, more important than Eridu. Nippur held the tablets of destinies. Nippur held the records office. Nippur was where the family met when they met at all, during the long peace. And Enlil's authority in Nippur was uncontested. What alarmed Enlil about Eridu was something more specific. It was the humans of Eridu. It was the way they were behaving. It was the fact that they were, in Enlil's assessment, becoming something the family had not authorized them to become. The scribes are careful about this. They do not say Enlil hated the humans. They say Enlil distrusted the humans. And the distrust was rooted, according to the record, in 3 specific observations. The first was that the humans of Eridu were learning to write, not just to keep tally marks, which the family had allowed, but to write in a way that captured speech. To capture speech in written form is to capture instruction, which meant the humans could now preserve knowledge across generations without needing the family to reteach it each time. The second observation was that the humans of Eridu had begun to observe the sky, not casually, systematically. They were tracking the movements of the lights above. They were making predictions about when the lights would return to certain positions. And their predictions over time were becoming accurate, which meant that the humans were beginning to understand the schedule of the family's own operations. And the third observation was the most alarming of all. The humans of Eridu were beginning to build things that they had not been taught to build. Small things at first, better boats, better nets, better tools for grinding grain. But the direction was clear. Left alone, the humans would eventually build larger things. Things that would compete with the family's own installations. Things that would, over enough time, close the gap between what the humans were and what the family was. Enlil raised this concern in a council. The tablets do not record the full transcript, but they record the outcome. Enki defended the humans. Enki argued that the humans' development was the intended outcome of the design, and that curtailing it now would be a betrayal of the original agreement. Enlil argued that no such agreement had been made, and that if Enki had made a private agreement with the humans, he had exceeded his authority. An, from Anna, refused to rule. He told the 2 brothers to resolve it between themselves, which, in the family's language, meant that An knew a fight was coming and did not intend to prevent it. The fight, when it came, did not begin with an army. It began with a weapon. Enlil had, during the long peace, developed a device that the tablets refer to only obliquely, and which the scribes were clearly forbidden from describing in detail. What we can reconstruct from the fragments is that the device was atmospheric. It could be positioned above a target from a great height. It did not use fire or explosion in the ordinary sense. It used something the scribes called the breath of Enlil, which is a formula they applied to several different weapons, and which most modern interpreters now read as some kind of concentrated pressure or sonic pulse or electromagnetic burst. Whatever it was, it did not leave craters. It did not leave burn marks. What it did was kill the living things beneath it, over a defined radius, while leaving the buildings and the infrastructure intact. Enlil deployed this weapon over Eridu. He did not deploy it to kill everyone. He deployed it as a demonstration. He targeted a specific quarter of the city, the quarter where the humans had built their observatory, the place where they were making their sky predictions. And in a single pass, without warning, he emptied that quarter of every living thing. The humans in the observatory died at their instruments. The birds in the trees fell. The fish in the canal beside the observatory floated to the surface. The dogs in the streets simply lay down and did not get up. And then the weapon lifted, and Enlil's message was delivered, and the message was clear. The humans of Eridu had been observing what they were not authorized to observe. That would end now. Enki was not in Eridu when it happened. He was inspecting a mine in the southern mountains, and by the time he received word and returned, the demonstration was complete. He walked through the emptied quarter. He counted the dead. And then, according to one of the older tablets that survives only in fragments, he did something that had never been done before in the family's history. He filed a formal complaint against his brother, in the name not of himself, but of the humans. He argued that Enlil had committed an act of war against a population under Enki's protection, and that under the terms of the first division, Enki was entitled to a response of equivalent scale. An, from Iana, was forced to respond. This was not something he could delegate. This was a direct challenge from one senior son to the other, and the entire family was watching to see how the father would handle it, and called a full council. Every regional commander was required to attend. The council was held not in Nippur, which was Enlil's ground, and not in Eridu, which was Enki's ground, but in a neutral location the tablets call the place of the meeting, which was, based on the descriptions, a purpose-built installation somewhere in the mountains between the two territories. And at that council, Enki laid out his complaint, and Enlil laid out his defense, and the council debated for what the tablets describe as 3 cycles, meaning 3 full days of the family's own calendar, which was longer than a human day, and which meant that in human reckoning, the debate lasted more than a week. The council's ruling was a compromise, and like most compromises, it satisfied The council ruled that Enlil had exceeded his authority by using a weapon of that class inside a populated city, but it also ruled that Enki had exceeded his authority by allowing the humans to advance their observations to the level they had reached. Both brothers were reprimanded. The weapon was ordered to be sealed. The observatory in Eridu was ordered not to be rebuilt in the same place, though it could be rebuilt elsewhere under supervision. And the humans of Eridu were ordered to have their memory of the demonstration erased. This was not a metaphor. The tablets are specific about the mechanism, though the mechanism itself is not described in a way that we can fully reconstruct. What the tablets say is that the family's medical branch, under Ninhursag, was tasked with the erasure, and that the erasure was performed on the entire surviving population of Eridu over the course of 1 full lunar cycle, and that at the end of that cycle the humans of Eridu did not remember what had happened in their own city 3 months before. That is the second battle. It is called a battle even though there was only 1 exchange of force, because in the family's own reckoning, any act that shifted the terms of the first division counted as a battle, whether or not there was a return of fire. Enlil had fired. Enki had not returned fire, but had escalated the political conflict to the level of the father. The father had ruled, and the terms of the first division had been amended, quietly, without formal acknowledgement, in a way that both brothers understood and neither brother was satisfied with. The consequences of battle too rippled outward for centuries. The humans of Eridu, having had their memory of the demonstration erased, did not learn from the demonstration, but the family remembered. And the memory of the demonstration hardened Enlil's position. He now had a precedent. He had used a weapon of that class against a human population, and he had received only a reprimand. The next time he decided to use such a weapon, he could expect a similar reprimand at worst, which meant that the threshold for use had been lowered. And Enki, understanding this, began quietly to prepare defenses. He began to hide certain knowledge in places where Enlil could not reach it. He began to instruct certain humans, in secret, to preserve information that the family had ordered erased. And most importantly, he began to think about what he would do if his brother ever moved against a human population on a larger scale than the demonstration at Eridu. He did not have to wait long to find out. Battle 3. The Siege of the Underworld Gate. Before we begin, a word about what the Sumerians meant by underworld. The word did not mean afterlife. It did not mean hell. It did not mean any of the things the later religious traditions built on top of the older concept. The Sumerian underworld, in the original administrative sense, was a place, a geographic location, a network of installations built into the deep crust of the planet, accessible by shafts and tunnels that led down from specific surface entrances, and administered by a branch of the family whose senior commander was a female named Ereshkigal. She was Inanna's older sister. She was, according to the tablets, the ranking authority for everything below the surface, in the way Enlil was the ranking authority for everything above it. And the war that broke out over her domain, in the third battle, was a war that most modern readers do not even recognize as a war, because the tablets describe it in language that has been translated for centuries as religious metaphor. It was not metaphor. It was a siege. The underworld installations existed for a specific purpose. They were the deep mines, not the surface mines that Enki had originally directed, but the far older mines that predated the family's arrival on this planet, and which had been operated by an earlier generation of the family, or, according to some of the older tablets, by a different family entirely, whose relationship to the current family is not clear. What is clear is that the deep mines were the primary source of the material the family needed for its homeworld work. The surface mines produced material, but the surface mines were shallow, and their yields were low compared to what came out of the deep. The deep was where the real work happened. And the deep, according to the record, was administered by Ereshkigal, and the deep answered to Ereshkigal alone, And the deep was, for reasons that will become clear, a place that neither Enlil nor Enki could freely enter. Between the surface and the deep, there was a gate. Actually, there were 7 gates, arranged in sequence, each of them a checkpoint at which anything descending from above had to be verified, and each of them a checkpoint at which anything ascending from below had to be verified. This is where the later mythology of the 7 gates of the underworld comes from. It is not, in the original conception, a mystical arrangement. It is a security system, and the security system had been designed for a specific reason. Someone, at some point in the deep past, had tried to take the underworld installations by force. The system had been built after that attempt to make sure it could not happen again. We know almost nothing about the first attempt. The tablets that describe it are among the most fragmentary in the entire corpus, and what survives is unreadable in the strict sense, meaning that even scholars who have spent their lives with this material will admit, quietly and only in private, that they do not know what happened before the 7 gates were built. What they do know is that the 7 gates were built, and they were maintained, and Ereshkigal, from her seat in the deep, held the keys. The third battle began when Inanna descended to the underworld. The tablets describe this descent in enormous detail, more detail than any other event in the entire 10-battle sequence, and the reason for the detail is that the descent was, in every meaningful sense, an act of war. Inanna did not go to the underworld to visit her sister. Inanna went to the underworld to take it. She descended with authorization she had not been granted. She descended in the uniform, or the ceremonial dress, whichever term you prefer, that would have made her indistinguishable from a ranking authority of the deep. She descended with weapons concealed. She descended, in short, as an infiltrator, and the moment she passed the first gate, she was recognized as such, because the security system at the first gate was more sophisticated than she had accounted for. The story you have probably heard is that Inanna was stripped of an article of clothing at each of the 7 gates, and that by the time she reached her sister she was naked and defenseless. That is the surface reading, and it is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What actually happened, according to the more technical fragments, is that at each gate one of Inanna's concealed items was detected and removed. Her weapons, her communications devices, her authorization tokens, her personal shielding, her medical kit, her one-way transport recall, and finally, at the 7th gate, her identity itself, which in the family's technology meant her registration signature, without which she could not be identified by any other family installation as being who she was. By the time she reached Ereshkigal, she was, in the fullest sense, the family understood the word nobody. And nobody, in the family's law, had no rights, and no protections, and no recall. Ereshkigal, according to the tablets, was waiting for her. Ereshkigal had known Inanna was coming from the moment Inanna crossed the first gate, and possibly before, because Inanna's operation had not been as secret as Inanna had believed. There had been a leak. There is almost always a leak in these operations, and this one was no exception. The leak, according to one of the fragments, had come from Inanna's own advisor, a subordinate whose name is given as Ninshubur, and who had, at some point in the planning, informed Ereshkigal's own advisors of what was being planned. Whether Ninshubur was a double agent or whether Ninshubur simply made a tactical error is not clear from the surviving material. What is clear is that Ereshkigal knew the meeting between the 2 sisters was not a conversation, it was a trial. Ereshkigal charged Inanna with an unauthorized attempt to seize the deep, laid out the evidence, called the witnesses, and pronounced sentence. The sentence was death. And the death, in this case, was not the human kind of death. It was a technical death. Inanna's biological functions were suspended by a device the tablets describe as the Eye of Ereshkigal, and her body was hung on a hook on the wall of the deep in a state of preservation that was neither living nor dead, and that could be reversed only by Ereshkigal herself. For 3 days, in family reckoning, Inanna hung on the hook. On the surface, above, the family began to notice her absence. Ninshubur, the advisor, had been given prior instructions in case the operation failed. If Inanna did not return within a set period, Ninshubur was to go to the 3 senior authorities in sequence, first to Enlil, then to Nanna, then to Enki, and request rescue. Ninshubur did exactly this. Enlil refused. Enlil's response, according to the tablet, was that Inanna had gone where she had no authority to go, and if she had died there, that was the price of her overreach. Nanna, Inanna's own grandfather, also refused. His reasoning was different. He said that if he intervened in the deep, he would be triggering a full siege, and that a full siege would produce casualties on both sides, and that Inanna, however dear she was to him, was not worth that cost. Enki was the third and last resort, and Enki did not refuse. Enki understood something the other two authorities had missed. He understood that if Inanna died in the deep, the terms of the second division, which had been the amended first division after Battle 2, would collapse, because the second division depended on the family being able to conduct operations across the surface without violating each other's zones of authority. If Ereshkigal was allowed to kill Inanna in the deep, without consequence, then any regional commander could kill any other regional commander who entered their zone, and the family's own internal security would collapse. Enki understood this. Enlil should have understood it too. But Enlil's dislike of Inanna, which is documented across many tablets, had clouded his judgment. Nanna's love for Inanna had clouded his in the other direction. Enki was the only senior authority who saw the situation clearly, and Enki acted. What Enki did was not a rescue in the ordinary military sense. He did not send a strike force to the deep. He did not attempt to breach the seven gates. He did something more clever and more legalistic, which was characteristic of Enki's approach in general. He constructed two beings, described in the tablets as neither male nor female, and he gave them a very specific set of instructions. They were to descend to the deep. They were to enter through the gates in a way that the security system could not classify, because they were of a category the system had not been designed to detect. And once they reached Ereshkigal, they were to perform an act of ritual sympathy that would obligate Ereshkigal, under the family's own social law, to grant them a boon of their choosing. The boon they were to request was Inanna's body. The plan worked. Ereshkigal was, according to the tablets, in a state of what modern readers would call post-natal distress, having recently produced a child under difficult circumstances. The two beings that Enki had constructed were designed to be sympathetic to that specific state, and their sympathy was accepted, and the boon was granted, and Inanna's body was released. But there was a condition, and the condition was one of the oldest conditions in the family's law. Nothing can leave the deep without something being left behind in its place. This was not a spiritual principle. It was, again, a security protocol. The system was set to detect imbalances in the flow of persons across the gates. If Inanna left the deep without a substitution, the system would flag the departure as an unauthorized removal, and Inanna would be pulled back, automatically, regardless of any boon. So Inanna returned to the surface, but she returned with an escort, a pair of what the tablets called demons, which in the older sense meant something more like enforcement officers, and they were not there to help her. They were there to identify her substitute. Someone had to be left in the deep in her place. And Inanna, who had descended in an act of aggression and returned in an act of humiliation, was in no mood to be generous about who she selected. The escort followed her back to her city. It followed her to her husband's court. And when it found her husband, Dumuzi, sitting on his throne, in his fine robes, not in mourning, not in distress, but comfortable and well, Inanna made her selection. She pointed at him. The demons took him. He was carried down through the seven gates, in her place, and hung on the same hook she had been hung on, and the balance of the deep was restored. That is the version of the story most people know. What most people do not know is that this event, the descent and the substitution, was not personal drama. It was the opening move of the third battle. Because after the substitution, Enki began a slow campaign to compromise the seven gates. He did not attempt to breach them by force. He worked from the inside. He placed his own agents at each of the seven checkpoints over the course of many years, and he arranged for the security protocols to be gradually loosened. The purpose was not to raid the deep. The purpose was to eventually be able to enter the deep freely, on official business, without being subject to Ereshkigal's veto. And by the end of the third battle, which the tablets say lasted a period roughly equivalent to 1,000 of our years, Enki had achieved his objective. The seven gates were still there, but they no longer answered to Ereshkigal alone. They answered to a joint authority, and the deep, which had been an independent branch of the family, had been folded into the broader command structure. Ereshkigal was not deposed. That was Enki's cleverness. He never openly moved against her. He simply erased her independence, in a way she could not object to publicly, because each of the individual steps had been justified as an administrative reform. By the time she understood what had been done, it had been done. And Ereshkigal, according to the tablets, retreated into a form of internal exile in her own domain, no longer taking part in the family councils, no longer speaking in her own name, allowing subordinates to represent her. She is a haunting figure in the later material. She appears occasionally. She never speaks. She is described as sitting in a dark chamber with her face turned to a wall. That is how the third battle ended, not with a bang. with a slow suffocation of an entire branch of the family. And the deep mines, which had been Ereshkigal's, began producing for a joint account. Enki's share increased. Enlil's share increased. And a new practice began, which was that a portion of the deep's production was now diverted, quietly, to Marduk, to Enki's son, to the ambitious young man who was building his following on the argument that his father was the rightful heir to Eanna. That diversion, small at first, would eventually become a significant flow of resources, and those resources would fund the preparations for the war we will describe in Battle 4. Marduk was arming himself. Nobody in the senior generation had noticed yet, but Marduk was arming himself, and the family was, without knowing it, walking toward its second major fracture. Battle 4. The War of the Watchers. The fourth battle is the one you have heard about, though you have almost certainly heard it in the wrong form. You have heard it as a story about angels. You have heard it as a story from the Book of Enoch, and from Genesis chapter 6, and from the fragments of the older Hebrew tradition that describe a group of divine beings who came down from heaven, took human wives, produced a race of giants, and were punished for it. That is the surface reading, and it is not wrong, but it is a fragment. It is the version of events that was preserved by one particular human population, and it was preserved by them because it had been given to them by one particular branch of the family, and that branch of the family had its own reasons for wanting the story remembered a particular way. The full record, as the Sumerians preserved it, is more complicated, and it does not describe angels. It describes a security force that went rogue. The Watchers, in the original Sumerian sense, were not spiritual beings. They were personnel. They were a specific unit within the family's command structure, tasked with the observation and management of the human population from installations positioned on and around the planet. They were called the Igigi in the older texts, and the Watchers in the later ones, and the two terms refer to substantially the same group. Their commander, according to the fragments, was a senior officer named Shamyaza, and his second in command was named Azazel, and beneath them there were, depending on which tablet you read, either 200 or 300 officers, each with their own subordinate teams. This was not a small unit. This was a substantial force, deployed across the planet, and it had been deployed there for a specific reason. The Watchers were the interface between the family and the humans. They were, in modern terms, the middle management of the entire operation. For a very long time, the Watchers performed their function without incident. They observed, they reported, they administered the local instructions that flowed down from Enlil and Enki through Nana and the other regional commanders. They lived in installations that were positioned above the surface but below the higher orbital platforms, and they lived apart from the humans, in the sense that they did not mix. They watched, they did not participate, and the family's policy on this point was strict. The Watchers were not to interact with the humans, except in the performance of their official duties. Then something changed. The tablets do not agree on exactly when the change began, but they agree that it began. The Watchers began to talk among themselves about the humans. Specifically, about the human females. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a slur. It is what the record says. The Watchers had been observing the humans for a long time, at close range, in high detail, and they had begun to develop what the older texts call an affection, which is a broader term in the original than what we would translate as attraction, and which encompassed something closer to what we would call a fascination, manned with a desire. The Watchers had begun to want the humans, not to observe them, to have them. Shamyaza, according to the tablets, tried to suppress this. He was the commander. He understood the implications. He knew that if the Watchers began to interact with the humans in the way they wanted to, they would be violating the family's policy, and the family's response would be severe, and Shamyaza would be the one held responsible. So he called his officers together, and he asked them to swear an oath, not to interact, to hold the line, to remain observers. And the officers, according to the fragments, swore the oath, all 200 or 300 of them, and Shamyaza believed for a period that the crisis had passed. It had not passed. It had only been driven underground. And within a period the tablets describe as short, meaning perhaps a few decades in human reckoning, the oath began to break, not by Shamyaza, by his own officers, one at a time, in individual acts that were concealed from the command. A Watcher would descend from his installation. He would take a human wife. He would return to his post. And then another Watcher would do the same, and another. And within a further period, the pattern had become widespread. and the human populations in certain regions had begun to produce children whose fathers were, in the strict biological sense, not human. These children are the Nephilim of the later tradition. The Sumerian record calls them by several names, none of which translate cleanly. What they were, in the physical sense, was different. They were larger than ordinary humans, and they matured faster, and they possessed abilities that ordinary humans did not possess. Some of the abilities were mental, some were physical, and some, according to the older fragments, were of a kind that we have no clear category for. What is important is that they existed, they were real, and they were multiplying, and their existence changed the balance of the entire human situation in a way that neither Enlil nor Enki had authorized and neither of them had planned for. Enlil found out first. Enlil found out because Enlil had his own observers, positioned to watch not the humans but the Watchers, and those observers had been reporting anomalies for some time. When Enlil compiled the reports, he saw the pattern. He went to An, and he demanded an intervention. An called a full family council, and the Watchers' commander, Shamyaza, was summoned to answer for what had happened under his command. Shamyaza did not deny it. He admitted, in the record, that he had lost control of his officers. He asked for mercy on the grounds that the officers had acted in defiance of his order, not in accordance with it. But he also, in the same testimony, added something that made his situation worse. He said that the officers, in their interactions with the humans, had taught the humans certain things. They had taught the humans the working of metals. They had taught the humans the making of weapons. They had taught the humans the use of certain plants for certain purposes. They had, in short, transferred knowledge that the humans had not been authorized to receive, and the transfer was so widespread that it could not be recovered. The family council reacted with something the tablets describe as a shared silence. This is a technical formula in Sumerian, and when it appears in the record, it indicates a moment of extreme gravity. The senior authorities did not speak, because none of them knew what to say. The transfer that had happened was, in their reckoning, irreversible. The humans now had knowledge they should not have had. That knowledge could not be untaught. It could be suppressed. It could be forbidden. It could be, over generations, allowed to fade. But it could not be erased. And every human generation from that point on would be a generation that had access, in some diminished form, to what the Watchers had transferred. Enlil proposed a solution that was, characteristically, extreme. He proposed the elimination of the affected populations. All of them. And he proposed further the elimination of the Watchers themselves. A clean sweep, a reset. Enki objected, for reasons that would later become clearer. But even Enki did not have a good counterproposal, because the knowledge transfer really had happened, and something really did have to be done. The council debated for what the tablets describe as many cycles, and eventually a compromise was reached. The Watchers who had participated in the transfer would be arrested, tried, and confined. Their offspring, the Nephilim, would be dealt with by a different mechanism, and the tablets are careful not to describe the mechanism directly, but the implication is that most of them did not survive the following generation, and the affected human populations would be marked for future action, with the specific form of the action to be determined later. The arrest of the Watchers is the fourth battle. It is called a battle because it was not a peaceful arrest. The Watchers had, by the time the family moved against them, become numerous and skilled and equipped, and many of them did not intend to be arrested. Shamyaza himself surrendered, according to the tablets, and accepted whatever fate the family had determined for him. Azazel did not. He fled. He and a portion of the Watcher force resisted, and the family had to deploy a strike force to bring them in, and the strike force met with resistance in a series of engagements across several regions of the planet. The engagements were short, in terms of duration, but they were intense, in terms of casualties, and they marked the first time the family's own senior enforcement units had been forced to fight against their own subordinate ranks. By the end of the fourth battle, the Watchers had been broken. Those who surrendered were confined in a place the tablets call the Desolation, which most modern interpreters have placed in a region of the far north, in what would later become the Caucasus or the far side of the Caspian. Those who resisted were killed. Azazel himself, according to one of the fragments, was captured alive and confined separately, in a place the tablets describe as underneath a mountain in a desert, though the desert in question is not identified in a way we can locate today. And a decision was made, at the highest level, that the humans who had received the transferred knowledge would be dealt with in the following battle, using a weapon and a method that had been discussed in the council, but had not yet been approved. That weapon, and that method, is the fifth battle. Battle 5. The Battle of the Twin Cities. The fifth battle is the one that left evidence you can walk to. If you go to the southeast end of the Dead Sea, on the Jordanian side, and you climb the ridge above what the local people call the Plain of the Destroyed, and you look down, you will see a stretch of land that is different from the land around it. It is a shade darker. The soil is chemically different. The vegetation grows differently on it, in the places where it grows at all, and in most of it, it does not grow. Beneath the surface, in samples that have been taken by researchers who were not funded by anyone who wanted a particular answer, the soil contains an unusually high concentration of certain isotopes. The isotopes are the kind that are produced by a very specific type of event, not by a volcano, not by a meteor, by a nuclear detonation, or by something functionally equivalent to one. 2 cities used to stand on that plain. Their names, in the tradition that most Western readers know, are Sodom and Gomorrah. In the older Sumerian source material, they had different names, and there were not 2 of them but 5, arranged in a rough cluster along the southern shore of what was then a much larger lake. 2 of the 5 were the principal cities, and it is those 2 that the later biblical tradition preserved. The other 3 were secondary settlements that were destroyed alongside them. All 5 went down in a single event, in the space of what the tablets call a portion of one day, and what happened there is the 5th battle, and it is the battle in which the family used, for the first and only time on the surface of a populated area, the weapon class that had been locked away after the First Sky War. The weapon was the one the tablets call the 7 that split. There were 7 of them. That is why the name. They were positioned in different regional depots, distributed across the planet, so that no single depot could be captured and all of them lost at once. The unlocking of any one of them required a council authorization, and the council authorization required a majority vote of the senior family, and the vote had been given for the destruction of the Twin Cities by a majority that included Enlil, Nana, and Ninhursag, and had been opposed by Enki, and had been abstained on by An himself, which was itself an unusual event, and which the tablets note with some emphasis. An did not oppose the deployment, but he did not endorse it either. He allowed it, which in family law was sufficient. The reason for the deployment, as it was given in the council record, was that the Twin Cities had become centers of the resistance. Resistance is my word, not the tablets. The tablets call them centers of the pollution, meaning the pollution of the humans who had received Watcher knowledge in the earlier era. Those humans had been marked for future action at the end of Battle 4. The action, when it came, was this. The Watcher-taught populations had, over the intervening centuries, coalesced in certain locations, and the Twin Cities were the 2 largest such coalescences. The knowledge had been preserved there, the metallurgical techniques, the astronomical observations, the plant lore. All of the transfers that the family had wanted to erase after Battle 4 had been preserved in the Twin Cities, and had continued to be preserved, and had continued to be developed by the humans in ways the family had not anticipated. The Twin Cities were, in the family's assessment, a threat. Enki argued, in the council record, that the Twin Cities were not a military threat. He argued that they were a cultural threat, meaning that they preserved knowledge the family wanted forgotten, and that the correct response to a cultural threat was not annihilation but suppression. He proposed a program of gradual assimilation. He proposed removing the leadership of the Twin Cities and replacing them with family-approved administrators. He proposed, in short, a coup rather than a bombing, and he was overruled. The tablets are careful to record who overruled him and why. Enlil overruled him on the grounds that assimilation had already been tried in an earlier era and had failed. Nana overruled him on the grounds that his own son, Nabu, had reported that the Twin Cities were producing a new generation of Watcher descent children, and that this generation was going to be the most difficult yet to manage if it was allowed to mature. Ninhursag overruled him on a ground that was more personal. Ninhursag had been present at the birth of many of the Twin City children, in her role as the family's chief medical authority, and she had observed something in them that she would not describe openly in the council, but which she indicated, in a private conversation preserved on a separate fragment, had convinced her that the Twin Cities could not be allowed to continue. What she saw, and what she would not describe, is one of the great gaps in the record. We do not know. We only know that whatever she saw was enough to move the council's most compassionate senior member into the column of those who voted for destruction. Enki, having lost the vote, did not simply accept it. He did what he had done before, and what he would do again, which was to work around the vote's implications while nominally complying with it. He could not stop the deployment, but, he could evacuate certain individuals. He identified, among the population of the Twin Cities, one family that he considered worth saving. The head of that family was named, in the Sumerian record, in a form that is difficult to translate cleanly, but which most modern scholars have equated with the figure that the biblical tradition preserved as Lot. Whether the equation is exact is a matter of debate. What matters is that Enki sent messengers to this family, in advance of the deployment, and warned them and instructed them to leave the region and not to look back. The instruction not to look back is one of the details that has been most misunderstood over the centuries. It has been read as a moral instruction, a test of faith, a psychological metaphor. It was none of those things. It was a technical instruction. The weapon that was about to be deployed produced a flash and a rising column of energy, and looking directly at either the flash or the column caused permanent damage to the eyes and, in cases of prolonged exposure, damage to the nervous system beyond the eyes. The instruction not to look back was a warning. Do not turn toward the detonation. Do not look at the column. Cover your face if you can. And in the biblical version, one member of the family did look back and was killed, and the account describes her as being turned to a pillar of salt. That description has been read as poetic. It is more likely, given what we now know about certain kinds of radiation exposure, a direct description of what happens to a human body that has been struck by a high-energy pulse at close range. The body loses its water. It becomes rigid. It maintains its shape but loses its substance, and it stands like a pillar where it fell. The deployment itself is described in the Sumerian tablets in language that is, once you decode it, harrowing. The 7 weapons were not used all at once. They were used in a coordinated sequence. Each one was directed at a specific target. 2 of the 7 struck the 2 principal cities. The other 5 struck secondary targets, 3 of them, the smaller settlements in the same plain, and 2 of them targets in the surrounding region that the tablets do not fully specify, but which appear to have been either escape routes or military installations of some kind. The result was that the entire plain was leveled, the 2 principal cities were reduced to ash, the 3 secondary settlements were reduced to less than ash, and a plume rose over the region that was visible, according to the tablets, from every horizon within a great distance, and remained visible for several days. The plume then drifted. The tablets are precise about this, in a way that the biblical tradition is not. The plume drifted to the north and east. It carried whatever the weapon had produced. And what the weapon had produced was, we now understand, a mix of radioactive isotopes and heavy particulate matter, and something the tablets call the evil wind, which was the name the scribes gave to fallout without knowing what fallout was. The evil wind moved across the region over a period of weeks. It moved north, it moved east, and it reached the cities of Sumer itself. It reached it reached Uruk, it reached Nippur, and in those cities, in the weeks that followed the deployment, the humans began to fall sick and die. This is the part of the 5th battle that is almost never told. The weapon that was aimed at the Twin Cities also destroyed the family's own primary human population, in the family's own primary cities, not directly died but through the fallout. The tablets refer to this as an unforeseen consequence, and they place the blame variously. Enlil, in his own retrospective, admits that the wind was not anticipated. Enki, in his retrospective, argues that the wind had been anticipated by anyone competent enough to think about it, and that Enlil had chosen to proceed anyway, which meant that the destruction of Sumer's own cities was, in effect, a second consequence of Enlil's decision that the council had not authorized. Enki formally filed a second complaint. The complaint was not adjudicated in the record that survives. It was, apparently, allowed to sit. The consequences of the fallout were catastrophic in a way that the tablets describe with unusual emotional weight. The scribes who preserved this material were themselves survivors of the descendants of those who had lived through it. And their voices, when they describe the sickness and the dying, break in a way that is unlike the voices we hear elsewhere in the Sumerian corpus. They describe children who could not keep down food. They describe women who could not carry pregnancies. They describe men whose skin came off in sheets. They describe animals in the fields dying and being unable to be eaten because the meat itself was, in some way they could sense but not explain, poisoned. And they describe, most terribly, the family. They describe how the family, in the aftermath, withdrew. That is the key detail. The family withdrew, not entirely, but substantially. Enlil, from Nippur, retreated to the highlands, where the wind had not reached as strongly, and he did not return to the affected cities for a long time. Enki, from Eridu, remained closer to his people, but his own city was also affected, and his own health, according to one fragment, suffered for a period after the wind passed. Ninhursag went into a kind of mourning that the scribes describe with reverence and horror. She had voted for the deployment, she had seen the results in the twin cities. But she had not anticipated the wind, she had not anticipated Sumer, and the deaths of Sumerian mothers and children, whom she had midwifed personally over generations, hit her in a way she was not equipped to bear. She left the field. She retired to a place the tablets call the Mountain of Ninhursag, which was located, based on the descriptions, in the region that is now northern Iran or Turkmenistan, and she did not participate in family councils again for what appears to have been an extended period. Marduk saw an opening. This is where the fifth battle bleeds into the beginning of a longer conflict that will occupy battles 6 and 7. Marduk had been arming himself, quietly, using the diverted resources from the deep mines, for a long time. He had been building a following, particularly among the second-generation family members and among a specific human population that he had cultivated in a city that would later become Babylon, though at the time of the fifth battle, it was still a smaller settlement of a different name. Marduk, watching his uncle Enlil authorize the destruction of the twin cities, and watching the fallout kill his father's own people, made a calculation. He calculated that Enlil had exceeded any conceivable authority. He calculated that the council, which had voted for the deployment, was complicit in the mass killing of a human population under Enki's protection. And he calculated that the moment to press his claim to the succession, the claim he had been preparing for centuries, had arrived. He did not press it immediately. Marduk was patient. But he began, in the years after the fifth battle, to consolidate. He began to move his followers. He began to establish the city that would become Babylon as his personal seat, distinct from Eridu, which was still his father's, and distinct from Nippur, which was Enlil's. He began, in short, to build a third pole in the family's politics, and he did it in a way that the senior generation, distracted by the aftermath of the fallout and the recovery of Sumer, did not fully register until it was well underway. That is the fifth battle in its full shape. 2 cities destroyed, 3 secondary settlements destroyed, a plume that drifted and killed the family's own people, a senior member of the family withdrawing from the field, a junior member of the family beginning, in the shadow of the disaster, to build the platform for his own eventual rise, the evidence you can still walk to, the isotopes that are still in the soil, the stories that survived, in fragmentary form, in every culture that had contact with the survivors of that region. It happened. It left a mark. And the family, whatever else you want to say about them, never used the 7 weapons on the surface again. They had learned something at last, or so the scribes believed. Whether they had actually learned it, or whether they had only learned to hide their use of it, is a question the tablets do not answer, and which we will revisit when we come to the 10th battle. For now, the 5th battle ended. The plain was silent. The wind, eventually, blew itself out. Sumer, over generations, recovered, though it was never quite the same. And Marduk, in Babylon, began the long work of preparing his move. Battle 6. The Silent War in the Ice. The 6th battle happened in a place the humans of Sumer had never seen and could not accurately describe. It happened at the far north of the planet, in the region we would now call the polar ice. And it happened there because that is where a particular installation had been positioned, and that installation was the target. The battle is called silent because the humans of the temperate zones did not know it was being fought. It produced no plume they could see. It produced no wind they could feel. It produced no fallout that reached their cities. What it produced was a change, a very slow and very gradual change in the behavior of the ice itself. And by the time the change became visible on the temperate coasts, in the form of rising water levels along certain rivers, the battle was long over and the losing side had already withdrawn. The installation in the ice was one of the family's oldest. It predated the First Sky War. It predated, according to some of the fragments, the family's own arrival on this planet, though the interpretation of those fragments is disputed. What is not disputed is that the installation existed, that it had been there for a very long time, and that it served a function that the tablets refer to only in guarded language. The function was climatic. The installation regulated the movement of the great currents in the Northern Ocean. And through those currents, it regulated the pattern of storms that moved across the northern continents. And through those storms, it regulated the temperature of the air and the movement of the moisture and, ultimately, the growing conditions in every land beneath the northern latitudes. This installation was, in effect, a thermostat. And whoever controlled the thermostat controlled the food supply of a large portion of the human population. For most of the family's history on the planet, the installation had been operated as a shared asset. It was not the property of any one branch. It was administered by a small technical crew whose loyalty was to the family as a whole, and its settings were adjusted only by council decision. This arrangement had held throughout the First Sky War, throughout the demonstration at Eridu, throughout the Siege of the Deep, throughout the Watcher Crisis, and throughout the destruction of the Twin Cities. Whatever else the family fought about, they had not fought about the ice installation, because to fight about it was to risk breaking it, and to break it was to invite consequences that none of them could fully predict. That agreement broke during the Sixth Battle. It broke because of Marduk. In the decades after the destruction of the Twin Cities, Marduk had continued his slow work of consolidation. He had built his Babylonian following. He had gathered a core of second-generation family members who had never been fully brought into the senior council and who felt, correctly, that they had been passed over. He had, most importantly, established relationships with two of the technical crews at three of the family's key installations. One of those installations was the Deep Mines, where his father Enki still had the primary influence. Another was the ceremonial complex at which was Nana's, but where Marduk had cultivated a young officer who owed him favors. And the third was the ice installation in the far north. The technician he had cultivated at the ice installation was named, in one of the fragments, Kingu, though whether this is a proper name or a title is disputed. Kingu had been at the ice installation for a long period. Kingu understood its systems. Kingu had, over the years of Marduk's slow cultivation, come to believe that Marduk was the rightful successor to the senior authority, and that when Marduk took the seat, Kingu would be elevated to a position commensurate with his talents, which was a position he did not currently hold, and which he believed he deserved. Marduk had made no such promise in writing. Marduk rarely made promises in writing, but the understanding was clear enough that Kingu was prepared to act on it. The action, when it came, was subtle. Kingu did not deliver the installation to Marduk in a single dramatic transfer. He simply began, over a period of years, to adjust the installation's settings in a direction that favored certain regions and disfavored others. The regions that were favored were the regions where Marduk's own following was strongest. The regions that were disfavored were the regions where Enlil's influence was primary. This was, in effect, a slow economic strangulation of the Enlil-aligned human populations, performed through weather. The growing seasons in the Enlil regions began to shorten. The rainfall patterns shifted. The rivers, in some places, began to run lower during the harvest months than they had in living memory. And the human populations under Enlil's regional command began, incrementally, to suffer. Enlil noticed. Enlil was not a careless commander, whatever else he was. He tracked the yields in his own regions. He noticed the shortfalls. He commissioned investigations. And the investigations, over time, traced the pattern back to the ice installation. When Enlil received the report, he understood immediately what was happening. He understood that someone was manipulating the shared asset for private purposes, and he understood that the beneficiary of the manipulation was Marduk, and he understood that Marduk had, in doing this, committed an act that fell somewhere between administrative sabotage and open warfare. Enlil did not, at first, respond openly. He did what senior commanders often do when they discover a subordinate move. He gathered evidence. He built the case. He identified Kingu as the operating agent. And he prepared, quietly, a response that would recover the installation without giving Marduk the pretext to call the response an act of aggression. The response was a raid. Enlil authorized a small strike force, drawn from his most trusted officers, to descend on the ice installation, remove Kingu from operational control, restore the installation settings to their original values, and place a new technical crew of Enlil's own choosing. The strike force was to move fast, to conceal its approach, and to complete its work before Marduk could react. And for a period, the strike force succeeded in its objective. It reached the installation. It removed Kingu. It restored the settings. And it began, with the new crew, to bring the installation back to its neutral function. But Marduk had not been idle. Marduk had, in fact, anticipated something like this response. He had positioned a small counterforce in the region, disguised as a survey team, and when Enlil's strike moved on the installation, the counterforce moved to intercept. The engagement that followed was small in scale, in the sense that only a few dozen family personnel were involved on each side. But it was the first engagement in which family personnel had openly fought other family personnel since the First Sky War, and it broke a threshold that the family had held for a very long time. This is where the sixth battle became, in the family's own reckoning, a battle rather than a raid. Because the moment two family units exchanged fire in the open, the political situation changed. The senior council could no longer treat the ice affair as a private dispute. It had to be adjudicated, and the adjudication would have to determine, on the record, which side had struck first, which side had been provoked, and what the consequences would be. The adjudication took a long time. It took, according to the tablets, more than a full generation in human reckoning, which meant that in family time it was still a substantial period. During that time, the ice installation was operated under a temporary joint command, with representatives of both Enlil's and Enki's factions physically present, and neither faction able to adjust the settings without the other's consent. The temporary command was uncomfortable and largely dysfunctional, and the humans in the affected regions continued to suffer from the after effects of the earlier manipulation, which had been reversed but which had left the climate in a period of instability. The instability, over time, produced a series of famines in the Enlil regions and a series of unusually favorable seasons in the Marduk regions, and the population balance between the two shifted in a direction that Marduk had wanted all along. By the time the adjudication was concluded, Marduk had, without ever formally winning the battle, gained substantially. His population base had grown, Enlil's had shrunk, and the precedent had been set. Family units could, if the political situation warranted, engage each other with force, and the senior council would take years to sort out the consequences. Marduk had learned this precedent. He would use it again, and the next time, the scale would be larger. But before we go on to the next battle, and to the escalation that followed the ice affair, there is something I need to add. Before we move on, stop for a second. What you just heard about the ice only makes sense on the full timeline, next to the 6 resets before it. Every arrival was scheduled. Every schedule leaves a trace. The 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. QR code is on your screen. Now, back to the ice. Because the story of the 6th battle does not end with the adjudication. It ends with a second-order consequence that the family did not fully appreciate at the time, and that the human populations of the Northern Hemisphere are still living with. When Enlil's crew restored the ice installation to its original settings, they did not, in fact, fully restore it. This is a detail that the tablets note obliquely, and that most modern commentators have missed. The settings had been manipulated for a period long enough that the ice itself, and the currents beneath it, and the great gyres of cold water that circulated around the pole had adjusted to the new pattern. When the settings were returned to their neutral values, the ice did not immediately return to its original configuration. It began to return, but the return was slow. It took, according to some of the fragments, several generations of the family's own reckoning, which meant many thousands of human years, and during that time the ice continued to behave in ways that produced anomalies in the human climate. Some of the anomalies were mild, some were severe, and one of them, which occurred toward the end of the return period, was severe enough to be preserved in human memory. The tablets describe it as a great cold, a period during which the ice extended further south than it had in the recorded era. A period during which certain northern regions became uninhabitable, forcing the human populations to migrate south and to abandon settlements that had stood for generations. This period corresponds, in the archaeological record we now have, to what is sometimes called the Younger Dryas, or, more broadly, to the end of the last major cold phase. Whether the correspondence is exact is a matter of continuing debate. What is not in debate is that a substantial cold event did occur, that it produced substantial human displacement, and that the tablets record it as a consequence of the 6th battle. Marduk, according to the record, was blamed for this, not officially. The council never issued a formal finding, but among the second generation of the family, and among the humans who were aware of the family's internal politics, the understanding was that Marduk had triggered the cascade. He had cultivated Kingu, he had manipulated the installation, he had produced the instability, and when the instability produced a mass die-off in the human populations of the northern regions, that die-off was, in the shared assessment, Marduk's responsibility. Marduk did not accept this framing. He argued, in a speech that is preserved in one of the longer fragments, that the die-off was Enlil's fault. Enlil had raided the installation. Enlil had disrupted the smooth operation. If Enlil had allowed the settings to remain where Kingu had placed them, the argument ran, the humans would have adapted, and the cold event would not have occurred. This argument is transparently self-serving. It ignores the fact that the settings Kingu placed were themselves the beginning of the disruption. But it is the argument Marduk made, and he made it repeatedly and forcefully, and to whoever would listen. And he began to build, out of this framing, the narrative that he would carry into the next battle. The narrative was this: Enlil was reckless. Enlil had authorized the destruction of the twin cities and produced the fallout that killed Sumerians. Enlil had raided the ice installation and produced the cold event that killed Northerners. Enlil, if he was allowed to remain in his senior position, would eventually produce a catastrophe from which the family could not recover. Therefore, Enlil had to be removed. And the removal, since the senior council would not authorize it, would have to be accomplished by other means. This is the moment at which Marduk began to plan, in earnest, for open confrontation with his uncle. The sixth battle had, in a sense, been the rehearsal. The seventh battle would be the performance. And the seventh battle, when it came, would not be silent. It would not be small in scale. It would draw in every faction of the family that still had a stake in the outcome. And it would end with a change in the senior authority that had held since and first stepped back from active command. But the seventh battle is where we go next. First, one final note about the sixth. The ice installation, after all of the events described, was placed under a permanent joint command that was strictly rotated between the factions. The rotation held for the remaining recorded history of the family's active presence on the planet, and the installation, so far as we can tell, is still there. It has not been operated in any of the ways the tablets describe for a very long time, but it has not been dismantled. It is still buried in the ice. Its function is still, in the technical sense, available. And if someone, at some future point, were to find it and understand it and activate it, the same manipulations that Kingu performed could be performed again, and the same consequences would follow. That is a possibility the tablets do not dwell on, but they do not deny it. The installation is dormant, not decommissioned, and dormant installations, in the family's history, have a way of being reactivated. Battle 7. The Battle of the Salt Sea. By the time the seventh battle, an old age, in Sumerian, meant a period long enough that the youngest members of the family had themselves grown old, and their children had grown old, and the events of the earlier battles had become, even within the family's own long memory, distant. The humans of Sumer had by now built and rebuilt their cities several times. The languages of the temperate regions had drifted. The knowledge that had been transferred by the Watchers, and that had survived the destruction of the twin cities, had been dispersed and hidden and re-encoded in forms the family could no longer easily track. The world had, in short, matured. And in that mature world, the seventh battle broke out in a place that had, until then, been peripheral to the family's operations. The Salt Sea, in the geography of the tablets, was not the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea was the plain of the destroyed twin cities, and it had been called the Salt Plain in some of the earlier texts. But the Salt Sea of the seventh battle was a different body of water. It was the great body that the humans of the northern coast called by many names and that we now call the Mediterranean. That body was, in the family's operational geography, the corridor. Everything moved through it. Trade moved through it. Personnel moved through it. Information moved through it. The islands within it were the way stations. The coasts around it were the primary population centers. And whoever controlled the corridor controlled the movement of everything that mattered on that half of the planet. Marduk moved on the Salt Sea because he had understood, from his study of the earlier battles, that in order to challenge his uncle Enlil directly, he needed to control the movement of resources first. He could not fight Enlil in Enlil's own highlands. Enlil was too well positioned there. He could not fight Enlil in the deep, because the deep, though technically joint, still had residual loyalties to Ereshkigal's line, which was aligned with Enlil through old blood ties. Marduk had to fight where he was strongest, and he was strongest along the water, along the corridor, in the cities of the coasts and the islands, where his followers had established substantial populations, and where his own transport network could move his forces faster than Enlil's could move theirs. The immediate trigger of the battle was a family named, in the tablets, only by a title. The family in question was a subordinate branch of Marduk's own faction. They had been positioned at a key node on the corridor, one of the larger islands, and their function had been to administer the trade that passed through. At some point, and the tablets do not specify exactly when, this family had been ordered by Marduk to begin diverting a portion of the trade to a destination that was not the family's official inventory. The diverted portion was to go to a stockpile that Marduk was building in Babylon. The stockpile was for what use, the tablets do not say directly, but from what we can infer, it was for the arming of a force that Marduk intended to use in the coming confrontation with Enlil. The diversion was discovered. This is a recurring pattern in the 10-battle sequence. The plans are always discovered. The concealments always fail. And when the diversion was discovered, it was discovered not by Enlil's people but by an inspector who reported to the Joint Council, and whose report went not to any single senior authority but to all of them at once. The information could not be suppressed. It became the topic of a council meeting. And at that meeting, Enlil made the accusation directly. He accused Marduk of preparing for war. He demanded that Marduk's stockpile be seized. And he demanded that Marduk himself be recalled from his regional command and confined, pending an investigation. Marduk did not attend the council in person. He sent an intermediary. The intermediary delivered a statement, which is preserved in the record, and which is worth summarizing because it is one of the clearest windows we have into Marduk's own thinking. The statement said, in effect, that Marduk had not been preparing for war against the family. He had been preparing for the eventual and necessary consolidation of the family's operations under his own senior authority, which would occur when An eventually completed his withdrawal and when Enki, the current senior son, by lineage of the mother, either took the seat himself or, more likely, transferred it to Marduk as his heir. The stockpile, the statement continued, was not aggressive. It was preparatory. It was the material that would be needed to conduct the transition. And it was Enlil, not Marduk, who was interpreting the preparation as an act of war. This statement did not persuade the council. The council voted, by a substantial margin, to authorize a raid on the stockpile and to order Marduk's return to Babylon under conditions of what would now be called house arrest, though the Sumerian term is different. Marduk received the order. He did not comply. He remained in his southern seat, on the coast of the Salt Sea, and he began to activate the very stockpile the council had ordered seized. Within a period of what the tablets describe as a short interval, a force under Marduk's command had moved into position at 3 of the primary corridor nodes and had established what amounted to a blockade of the entire Salt Sea against family movement. This was the opening of Battle 7. From the family's perspective, Marduk had committed the definitive act of open rebellion. From Marduk's perspective, he had preempted an act of aggression that was already coming, and the blockade was defensive. Both perspectives are preserved in the record, and the record does not pick a winner between them. What the record does describe is what happened next. Enlil authorized a full mobilization. This had not been done since the First Sky War, and the tablets treat the mobilization order with the seriousness the family itself gave it. All regional commanders were placed on active status. All secondary weapons depots were unlocked. All communication channels between regions were placed under wartime protocols, and a strike force was assembled, larger than any that had been deployed since the arrest of the Watchers, and it was directed to move on Marduk's positions in the Salt Sea and to break the blockade by force. Enki did not initially participate in the mobilization. Enki was, in the strict sense, Marduk's father, and though he did not endorse his son's rebellion, he did not immediately act against it either. He held his forces in reserve. He tried, through intermediaries, to negotiate a stand-down. The negotiations failed. Marduk would not withdraw without concessions the council would not grant. Enlil would not concede anything to a subordinate who had defied a direct order. And after a period of stalemated diplomacy, Enki was forced into a position. He could either join his brother's mobilization against his own son, or he could join his son against his brother. He chose, according to the record, a third path. He declared neutrality. Neutrality, in the family's own law, was a formal status. Enki filed the declaration. It was accepted, reluctantly, by the council, and it meant that Enki's regional forces would not participate in the coming engagement on either side, and that his territories would remain closed to the movement of both Enlil's and Marduk's units. This was a substantial reduction in Enlil's operational flexibility, because Enlil had been counting on being able to move through the southern territories to reach Marduk's Babylonian base from an unexpected direction. With those territories closed, Enlil had to approach the corridor from the north and the east, which was slower and more predictable. The engagement in the Salt Sea itself was, in tactical terms, complicated. It was the first time the family had fought on and over water, and both sides had to improvise. Marduk's forces held the coastal cities and the primary islands. Enlil's forces had superior air assets, in the sense that the family's remaining orbital platforms were, by treaty, aligned with the senior council, which meant with Enlil, but the platforms could not be used freely against surface populations, because the memory of the Fifth Battle's fallout was still fresh, and neither the council nor Enlil personally was willing to authorize a repeat of that mistake. The engagement was therefore fought largely at the surface level, between forces of comparable technology. and it produced a stalemate that lasted, according to the tablets, for a full year of the family's reckoning. During that year, both sides suffered. Marduk's blockade damaged the family's overall operations, because supplies that should have moved through the corridor were rerouted through more difficult overland paths, and the yield of certain mines and installations fell. Enlil's mobilization drained his own reserves, because the strike force had to be maintained on active duty for an extended period without producing a decisive result. And the human populations along the corridor, who had not asked for any of this, suffered the standard consequences of being caught between contending powers. Cities were placed under military governance. Trade in essential goods was disrupted. Certain coastal populations were forcibly relocated, either because they were considered too close to a Marduk position or because they were considered a potential source of intelligence to the other side. The stalemate broke when Nabu, Marduk's son, made a proposal. Nabu, according to the tablets, had been serving as his father's second-in-command, and he had been, throughout the confrontation, more moderate than his father in the sense that he had continued to seek negotiated outcomes even as Marduk continued to insist on non-negotiable terms. Nabu proposed a settlement. The blockade would be lifted. Marduk would withdraw from his forward positions. In exchange, Marduk would be granted formal recognition as the senior authority for the regions south and east of the Salt Sea, meaning Babylon and its surrounding territories, and this authority would be independent of Enlil's in Nippur and Enki's in Eridu. In effect, a third seat would be created, and Marduk would occupy it. Enlil rejected the proposal, but Nabu had not delivered it only to Enlil. He had delivered it to the full council and to An, and An, from Eanna, responded. An was very old by this point, and he had not spoken in a council in a long period, and his intervention carried a weight that the individual senior sons could not counter. An endorsed the settlement. He instructed Enlil to accept it. And Enlil, according to the record, accepted it, though the record notes that his acceptance was given with a bitterness that would color his relations with his father and with Marduk for the remainder of his active command. That is how the seventh battle ended, not with a decisive engagement, not with a clear victor. It ended with a partition. A new senior seat was created. Marduk was elevated. The family's political geography, which had been binary since the First Division, became triangular, and the tablets note, with a certain grim understatement, that the triangular arrangement was inherently less stable than the binary one had been. In a two-party dispute, each party could at least anticipate the other's moves. In a three-party arrangement, any two parties could combine against the third, and the incentive to combine was permanent, and the identity of the two who would combine could shift, and the third who was left out would always have an incentive to break the arrangement by force before the combination could form. The seventh battle ended in a partition that guaranteed the eighth battle would come. And it did. Battle 8. The War Beneath the Sand. The eighth battle was fought underground, in the network of tunnels and chambers that ran beneath the desert of what is now the Sinai and extended into the eastern reaches of the Nile Valley. This network was not natural. It had been built. It had been built by the family in one of the earliest phases of their operations on the planet, for a purpose the tablets refer to as the launch. The word does not mean what it means in modern engineering. The launch, in the Sumerian sense, was the site from which materials refined on the surface were sent up to Eanna, and from Eanna were forwarded to the destination the tablets call the home. The launch was the family's primary logistical node for extraplanetary shipping, and in the years leading up to the eighth battle, it had become, quietly, a strategic asset that neither of the three now recognized senior seats controlled outright. The launch was administered by a technical staff who had, throughout the earlier battles, remained neutral by tradition. They had answered to An, and through An to the council as a whole, and they had considered themselves servants of the family rather than of any faction within it. This neutrality had been protected by the fact that the launch was the family's own lifeline. Without the launch, no material could be sent home. Without the launch, the entire purpose of the family's presence on the planet became academic. And so, for a very long time, all factions had a shared interest in keeping the launch functional and outside factional dispute. That shared interest broke down after the seventh battle. It broke down because the settlement that had ended the seventh battle had granted Marduk a formal senior seat, and the formal senior seat carried with it certain rights of participation in family logistics. Marduk, exercising those rights, requested that a portion of the launch's throughput be allocated to a stockpile that his own faction was managing. The request was, on the face of it, reasonable. It was consistent with the terms of the settlement, but the request was also, in a subtle way, an attempt to establish precedent. If Marduk could allocate throughput at the launch, then Marduk had operational influence at the launch. and operational influence, once established, could grow. Enlil objected to the request. He objected on the grounds that the launch's throughput was, by long practice, allocated by the neutral technical staff according to the family's collective priorities, and that permitting factional allocation would compromise the neutrality that had protected the launch through every prior conflict. Enki, for once, agreed with his brother on this point. Enki had his own reasons for wanting the launch to remain neutral. Enki understood that if the launch became factional, it became a target, and if it became a target, it could be damaged. And if it were damaged, the consequences would extend far beyond any of the 3 seats. The council debated the request, and in an outcome that surprised many observers, including apparently Marduk himself, the council voted to deny it. Marduk did not accept the denial. He argued that the denial was a violation of the settlement, and he began, in a series of moves that mirrored the pattern he had used before the 7th battle, to prepare a unilateral action. This time, however, the action would not be a blockade of a corridor. It would be a takeover of the launch itself. Marduk had concluded that if the council would not grant him a portion of the launch's throughput, he would take the entire launch and thereby make himself the arbiter of what got sent home and what did not. The takeover attempt is the 8th battle. The 8th battle happened underground because the launch was underground. The surface installation, which was the visible signature of the site, was actually a small part of the complex. The bulk of the launch was buried in a series of chambers and tunnels that extended for tens of kilometers beneath the surface, and that contained the fuel storage, the maintenance facilities, the crew quarters, the flight preparation areas, and, most importantly, the launch tubes themselves, which were vertical shafts sunk into the deep bedrock and rising to the surface through carefully engineered openings that could be shielded when not in use. The bulk of the launch was underground, and the fighting, when it broke out, was underground. Marduk's force entered the complex through a service tunnel whose location had been provided by an informant. The informant was a member of the launch's technical staff, whose motivations are not fully clear in the record, but who appears to have believed that Marduk would treat the staff more generously than Enlil had done. The force moved through the tunnel in the middle of a shift change, when security was minimally staffed, and it seized 3 of the primary chambers before any alarm was raised. The staff, at this point, was ordered to continue operating the launch under Marduk's authority, and the surface installation was informed by a communication that appeared to come from the neutral staff itself that a routine security exercise was in progress and that no external response was required. The deception held for a period. During that period, Marduk's force secured additional chambers, and Marduk himself descended to the launch to assume personal command. This was an unusual move. Marduk had not personally entered the field in any of the prior battles. His presence at the launch was, according to the tablets, an indicator of how important he considered the operation and of how confident he was that it would succeed. And for a period, it did succeed. Marduk held the launch, his force was in position, the staff was operating under his direction, and the throughput of the launch was, for the first time in the history of the family's presence on the planet, under the control of a single faction rather than the collective council. The situation was discovered by Enlil's own intelligence, which had been monitoring the launch for signs of unusual activity ever since the council had denied Marduk's request. The signs, when they appeared, were subtle. Shift schedules were slightly altered. Certain communications from the launch to the surface used slightly different signature patterns than the neutral staff normally used. Enlil's analysts flagged the anomalies. Enlil personally reviewed the flags, and within a period the tablets describe as brief, he concluded that the launch had been compromised. He convened an emergency council. Enki attended. Nana attended. Ninhursag attended, coming out of her long retirement for what she is quoted as calling the last time. And An himself, from Anna, participated by remote link. The council authorized a response, but the response was constrained by a factor that had not applied in any of the earlier battles. The launch could not be damaged. Any use of force that risked damaging the launch's core infrastructure, particularly the fuel storage or the launch tubes themselves, would produce consequences that would set the family back by a period that the tablets do not attempt to quantify but describe as very long. The response, therefore, had to be a precision operation. Force would have to be applied at specific points, in specific ways, to remove Marduk's occupation without damaging what he had occupied. Enki, characteristically, proposed the plan. He proposed that his own son should be given the opportunity to withdraw voluntarily. He proposed that a message be sent to Marduk, offering him a face-saving exit. He proposed that if Marduk accepted the exit, the family would treat the entire episode as a misunderstanding, and no further consequences would follow. This proposal, coming from the father of the offender, carried weight that a proposal from anyone else would not have carried. The council accepted it. The message was sent. Marduk rejected it. The tablets are careful to describe the exact terms of the rejection because those terms would matter for what came next. Marduk stated that he had entered the launch not as an act of aggression but as an act of correction. The council, in denying his allocation request, had violated the settlement of the seventh battle. He had taken the launch to enforce the settlement's terms. He would withdraw when the terms were honored, and until then, the launch would remain under his authority. This response converted the situation from a hostage crisis into an open engagement, because Marduk had now, on the record, refused a lawful order to withdraw from a facility he had seized. The council, having exhausted the peaceful option, was obligated to act. And it acted. The action was carried out by a specialized unit under the direct command of an officer named Ninurta, who was one of Enlil's sons, and who was, by reputation, the family's most capable ground commander. Ninurta had trained for exactly this kind of operation, and he moved quickly. His force entered the launch through a secondary tunnel that Marduk's people had not secured. They fought their way, chamber by chamber, toward the central control area where Marduk was positioned. The fighting was close and dark. It was fought largely with weapons that were, by family standards, low yield, because the risk of damaging the launch precluded the use of anything more powerful. Casualties on both sides were higher than in any of the previous engagements, and Marduk, according to the tablets, personally participated in the defense of the central chamber, using a weapon that is described in terms suggesting a personal energy device of some kind, and killing several of Ninurta's officers before he was, finally, overwhelmed. He was not killed. That was the crucial detail. The council had ordered him taken alive. Ninurta obeyed. Marduk was disarmed, restrained, and removed from the launch. The remainder of his force surrendered when their commander was captured. The staff was interrogated and, in the case of the informant who had opened the door, executed. The launch was returned to neutral operation, and Marduk was transported, under heavy guard, to a place the tablets call the Pyramid of Confinement, which most modern interpreters have identified with one of the Great Pyramids of Giza, though which one is disputed. Marduk was held in the Pyramid of Confinement for a period the tablets do not quantify. It was long. It was long enough that the humans of the region, who saw the pyramid from a distance and who understood that something was contained within it, developed a substantial mythology about the confinement without ever knowing exactly what was being confined. He was eventually released, but the release came at a cost. He was required to formally renounce his claim to the senior seat. He was required to acknowledge, in writing, that his actions at the launch had exceeded any authority the settlement had granted him, and he was required to accept a demotion in the family's internal hierarchy, from senior authority to junior authority, with all of the practical restrictions that demotion entailed. Marduk accepted the terms. He had no choice. But he accepted them with a resentment that he would nurse, quietly, for the entire remaining period of his presence on the planet. And when the 9th battle came, and the 10th battle after it, Marduk would still be there, still remembered, still bitter, and still calculating how to reverse what had been done to him at the pyramid. The 8th battle ended with him confined. But confinement is not defeat, and the family, in ending the 8th battle the way it did, had produced an enemy who would outlast every other player at the table. Battle 9, the Battle of the Broken Sky. The 9th battle was the last one that both sides intended to fight. Everything that follows in the 10th battle is different, in ways we will come to. But the 9th battle was, in the family's own reckoning, a conventional engagement between conventional forces, and it was fought over an issue that both sides believed could be settled by a decisive victory. The issue was Eanna itself. By the time of the 9th battle, An had completed his withdrawal. This is the crucial context. The father, who had held the highest seat for the entire sequence up to this point, and whose presence had ended every prior engagement by his final ruling, had decided that his active participation in the family's affairs was finished. The tablets are precise about what withdrawal meant. It did not mean death. The family did not die in the human sense, or at least not within the time frames that the tablets describe. Withdrawal meant that An had returned to the home. He had left Eanna. He had transferred his personal quarters, his instruments, his remaining authority, to a state the tablets call the reserve. He was, in effect, retired. He could be contacted, in an emergency, through channels that had been established for the purpose. But he would no longer intervene in council decisions. He would no longer overrule his sons. The senior seat, which he had occupied for the entire prior sequence, was now vacant. The vacancy triggered the ninth battle. Because the succession, which had been the underlying question since the first Sky War, was now no longer hypothetical. It was practical. Someone had to take the seat. And the two candidates who had, throughout the sequence, been the primary rivals for it, Enlil and Enki, were now in their own late stages of active service. Both of them were considered too old, by the family's own reckoning, to occupy the senior seat effectively for the period it would need to be occupied. The seat would have to go to the second generation. And in the second generation, the leading candidates were Nanna, who was Enlil's eldest son, and Marduk, who was Enki's, though Marduk's confinement in the pyramid and subsequent demotion had, on paper, disqualified him. Or so Enlil argued. Marduk did not accept the disqualification. He argued that the demotion had been a political punishment imposed under duress, that it had never been endorsed by Anne personally, and that with Anne withdrawn, the demotion had no binding force. He argued, further, that he was the senior son of the senior son by lineage of the mother, and that under the family's older succession law, this was the strongest possible claim to the seat. He filed his claim. Nanna filed his own claim in response. And the family, faced with two competing claims that could not both be honored, prepared for the engagement that had, in a sense, been coming since the fracture in Battle 1. The engagement was fought in the sky. This is what the name of the ninth battle refers to, the broken sky. Eanna itself was the primary theater, because Eanna was the prize. Whoever held Eanna held the senior seat, in the operational sense. And so both sides moved to secure Eanna, and the movement of both sides to secure it produced the exchange of fire that gave the battle its name. Nanna's forces moved first. Nanna was still, in the technical sense, the senior operational officer on the moon installation, which was the closest of the family's platforms to Eanna, and which was, therefore, the natural staging point for any occupation of Eanna itself. Nanna moved his personnel from the moon installation to Eanna, and he did so under the argument that, as the son of the current senior son by birth order, he was the presumptive successor pending council decision, and his occupation of Eanna was therefore lawful. Marduk's forces moved in response. Marduk had, during the period of his demotion, been quietly rebuilding his following, and though he could no longer command family units in his own name, he had allies among the second-generation members who did command them, and those allies were prepared to move on his behalf. The move, when it came, was directed at the moon installation, which Nanna had left partially staffed when he moved to Eanna. Marduk's allies took the moon installation with relatively light resistance, and from the moon installation they were now in a position to threaten Nanna's supply lines to Eanna. This created a standoff. Nanna held Eanna. Marduk's allies held the moon. Each side had cut off the other from the other's most likely source of reinforcement. And both sides began to look for a way to break the standoff before the family's overall stability collapsed under the strain. The break came from an unexpected direction. Ninurta, the officer who had led the assault on the launch during the 8th battle, and who had been rewarded for that assault with a substantial promotion, offered to mediate. Ninurta was, in the family's factional politics, aligned with Enlil, and therefore with Nanna. But he was known, personally, for a fairness that most of the second-generation officers did not possess, and both sides trusted him to at least attempt a genuine mediation. Ninurta proposed the following. Both sides would withdraw from their currently held positions. The moon installation would return to its neutral technical staff, as would Eanna. A council would be convened in a neutral location on the surface, and the succession would be decided by a formal vote of the second and third generations, with the votes weighted by rank. Whichever candidate won the vote would receive the senior seat, and the other candidate would receive a defined lesser seat with rights of participation but not of veto. Both sides agreed to the proposal. The withdrawal began. And that is where the 9th battle should have ended, with a peaceful resolution and a vote and a new senior authority installed in Eanna. That is not what happened. What happened was that during the withdrawal, one of Marduk's allies, an officer whose name the tablets record as Zu, decided that he would not accept a vote in which he expected his side to lose. Zu had been present at the moon installation. He had access to certain of its systems, and during the withdrawal, when the neutral technical staff was returning to its posts, Zu remained behind. He concealed himself. And once the withdrawal was complete and the moon installation was operating under its neutral protocols, Zu emerged from his concealment, moved to a specific chamber, and seized the object the tablets call the Tablet of Destinies. The Tablet of Destinies was not, despite its name, a religious artifact. It was a control device. It was the master authorization key for the family's automated systems on this planet and in its immediate vicinity. Whoever held the Tablet of Destinies could issue orders to any automated installation that was still under family control, and those orders would be executed without further authentication. The tablet had been kept, throughout the family's history on the planet, in a secured chamber at Nippur, but during the period of Anne's withdrawal, it had been transferred to the moon installation for what the tablets describe as safekeeping. That transfer, in retrospect, had been a mistake, because the tablet at the moon installation was closer to the surface, closer to Iana, closer to any of the theaters of active engagement, and it was accessible to anyone who could get inside the installation and reach the specific chamber where it was stored. Zhu got inside. Zhu reached the chamber. Zhu took the tablet, and with the tablet in his possession, he had, in a single stroke, seized authority over every automated system the family still operated on the planet. He could open sealed depots. He could redirect resupply flows. He could shut down installations. He could, if he chose, arm the 7 weapons that had been sealed since the 5th battle. Zhu did not immediately do any of these things. He fled the moon installation with the tablet. He escaped to a redoubt that had been prepared for him, in secret, by Marduk's faction, in a location that the tablets do not identify, but that was, based on the descriptions, in a remote mountain region far from any of the family's primary seats. And from that redoubt, he issued his terms. He demanded that Marduk be installed as the senior authority, without vote, without counsel, without further delay. If the terms were met, he would return the tablet. If they were not met, he would begin using the tablet to disrupt the family's operations at points of his choosing. The family was, for the first time in its recorded history, being blackmailed. The response was Ninurta again. Ninurta was tasked, personally, with recovering the tablet. He assembled a small force, chosen for speed rather than for mass, and he moved on Zhu's redoubt within a period the tablets describe as a matter of days. The engagement at the redoubt is one of the more vividly described in the entire corpus. Zhu, according to the tablets, defended the redoubt personally, using the tablet's authorization to activate several of the redoubt's defenses simultaneously. Ninurta had to disable the defenses one by one, moving through zones of the redoubt where the atmosphere had been electrostatically charged, where the ground itself had been made to move, where beams of force were being directed at his position from concealed emplacements. He lost members of his force. He was, at one point, cut off from his own supply. But he continued to advance. And in the final chamber of the redoubt, he engaged Zhu directly. And after what the tablets call an exchange of the 7 arrows, meaning a sustained duel with directed weapons, Zhu was killed and the tablet was recovered. Marduk was not directly implicated in Zhu's operation. The tablets are careful about this. Marduk denied all knowledge of Zhu's actions. He argued that Zhu had acted on his own initiative, motivated by personal ambition, and that Marduk's faction had not authorized the theft of the tablet. This may or may not have been true. The record does not resolve it. What is resolved is that the tablet was recovered, that Zhu was dead, and that the succession vote, which had been agreed to before the theft, now proceeded. The vote went to Nana. The vote was not close. When the 2nd and 3rd generations assembled and cast their weighted ballots, the theft of the tablet had contaminated the entire perception of Marduk's candidacy. Even members of Marduk's own faction, who might otherwise have voted for him, hesitated to associate themselves with what looked like a failed coup attempt. Nana received a substantial majority. He was installed as the senior authority, and Iana, which had been vacant since An's withdrawal, was formally transferred to him. Marduk received the lesser seat, as the mediation had originally proposed. He was granted rights of participation in the council. He was granted the continued operation of his Babylonian territories under his own regional command. But he was not the senior authority. He would never be the senior authority, and that outcome, imposed on him through the sequence of events that ran from Zhu's failed theft through the vote and installation of his rival, would remain a wound in Marduk's political identity for the entire remaining period of his presence on the planet. The 9th battle ended in a formal succession. That was, in the family's own reckoning, a success. The senior seat had been transferred without the collapse of the family's institutions. The Tablet of Destinies had been recovered. The blackmail had been resolved. And a new senior authority had been installed under conditions that the majority of the family recognized as legitimate. But the 9th battle also ended with something else. It ended with the family's internal politics permanently fractured along the lines that Marduk's ambition and defeat had created. The Enlil-Nana line held the senior seat. The Enki-Marduk line held a lesser seat, permanently, with no realistic prospect of ever holding the senior seat again. And the entire structure was now dependent on the continued willingness of both sides to accept the outcome. If either side ever decided to reopen the question, the family had no mechanism, withdrawn, to resolve it. There would be no father to make the final ruling. There would be only the two sides. And whatever they were willing to do to each other, that is the fault along which the 10th battle would run. Battle 10, the unfinished war. We have arrived at the battle that has not ended. Everything up to this point has been the record of engagements that were closed. That is what the tablets emphasize about the previous 9. They were closed. Truces were signed. Settlements were reached. Losers withdrew. Winners installed themselves. Whatever the internal costs, the family had, at each stage, been able to bring the fighting to a formal conclusion. The 10th battle is different. The 10th battle is the one that started and did not stop. Which is why, when we reach the end of this section, we are not going to be describing an aftermath. We are going to be describing a continuation. The 10th battle is the war we are still inside. To understand why it did not end, you have to understand what triggered it, and to understand that, we have to go back to the immediate period after the 9th battle. Nana had been installed. Marduk had been demoted to the lesser seat. The family's political geography had, in principle, been stabilized. But underneath the stability, something was changing that the family did not immediately notice. The humans were multiplying. I know this sounds like a modest observation. It is not. It is the observation that changes everything about what happens next. Because the humans, since the destruction of the Twin Cities and the recovery from the fallout, had entered a period of exceptional demographic growth. The population had rebounded. New cities had been founded. The knowledge that had survived from the Watcher transfer had been rediscovered in fragments and applied. Agriculture had improved. Metallurgy had advanced. Writing had spread. And by the time Nana took the senior seat, the human population of the planet was larger, by a substantial margin, than it had been at any prior point in the tablet's record. The family had, throughout the previous battles, been able to manage the humans, because the humans were relatively few, and because the family, whatever its internal divisions, had held a decisive technological superiority over them. Neither of those conditions was continuing to hold. The humans were becoming numerous, and the humans were, slowly and unevenly but persistently, closing the technological gap. Not on the family's most advanced systems. Those remained out of reach. But on the middle band, on the systems that the family used for regional administration, on the systems that the family used for local defense, on the systems that a determined and well-resourced human group could, with enough patience, understand and eventually replicate. Enki, characteristically, was the first to fully appreciate this. Enki, from Eridu, had been closer to the humans than any other member of the family for the entire sequence, and Enki understood, in a way that Enlil and Nana did not, that the humans were no longer a workforce. They were a rising power, and the family's continued presence on the planet, in the mode that had characterized the previous ages, was no longer sustainable. Enki began to advocate, in council, for a fundamental change of relationship. He proposed that the family should begin the process of transfer. Not withdrawal, exactly. Transfer. Certain functions that the family had previously performed for the humans should be delegated to human institutions. Certain knowledge that had been withheld should, under controlled conditions, be released. And the family's overt presence on the surface should be reduced, over a defined period, to a level compatible with the human's own developing capacity for self-management. Enlil rejected the proposal. Enlil, from Nippur, had never fully accepted that the humans were more than workers, and the idea that the family should transfer authority to them was, in his view, absurd. Nana, the new senior authority, agreed with his father. The proposal was tabled. Marduk, from Babylon, saw an opportunity in the disagreement. This is the pivotal move. Marduk had, since his defeat in the 9th battle, been building a base among the humans. Not among the humans of Sumer, who were Enlil's and Nana's traditional client population, but among the humans of his own Babylonian territories, and among a set of client populations he had cultivated further west. These humans were his. He had, over the course of the intervening period, provided them with certain training, certain instruments, certain organizational forms that the humans of Sumer did not possess. He had, in effect, built a human army that answered to him personally, and that was substantially more capable than any human population the other senior authorities could quickly mobilize. When Enki proposed the transfer, Marduk saw the opportunity to reframe the proposal in a way that would benefit him. He argued, in a series of speeches that are preserved in the record, that the transfer, if it happened, should not be to a diffuse and inchoate human institution, but to a specific human authority that could be trusted to manage the transferred functions responsibly. And the specific human authority he proposed was, unsurprisingly, one that would answer to him. He proposed himself as the sponsor of the transfer. He proposed his Babylonian humans as the initial recipients. He proposed, in effect, to convert his Babylonian client population into the family's designated human successor, with himself as the intermediary. This proposal, if accepted, would have made Marduk, indirectly, the most powerful member of the family, because he would have controlled the interface through which the family transferred its authority. He would have controlled the timing. He would have controlled the terms. And when the transfer was complete, he would, through his Babylonian humans, effectively govern the planet on the family's behalf. Enlil and Nana understood exactly what Marduk was proposing, and they refused. The refusal was not framed as a rejection of the transfer itself. It was framed as a rejection of Marduk's role. The senior authorities agreed, in principle, that some kind of managed transition of certain functions to human institutions might eventually be appropriate. But they insisted that the transition should be managed by the senior seat itself, not by a lesser authority, and certainly not by Marduk personally. Marduk, they argued, had already demonstrated in the 8th and 9th battles that he could not be trusted with responsibility on the family's behalf. To give him the transfer would be to hand him, retroactively, everything he had failed to seize through open action. Marduk did not accept the refusal. And here we come to the immediate trigger of the 10th battle. Marduk, having been denied the transfer through official channels, began to conduct it unilaterally. He began, in Babylon, to give his humans access to knowledge that had been reserved. He began to give them instruments. He began to give them, most crucially, a religious and political framework that positioned him as their patron and their protector against the rest of the family. He began to build, in effect, a human civilization that was not just aligned with him, but that considered itself a rival to the humans of Sumer, and considered the rest of the family as illegitimate. This was, in the family's own reckoning, a violation of everything that had held them together for the entire sequence of the previous 9 battles. The family had always operated on the assumption that whatever their internal disputes, they presented a unified front to the humans. The humans could not be allowed to see the family divided, because if the humans saw the family divided, the humans might, eventually, begin to take sides. And if the humans began to take sides, the humans might, eventually, become participants in the family's disputes, rather than observers of them. And once that happened, the family's control over the situation would be permanently compromised. Marduk crossed that line. He showed his humans that the family was divided. He recruited his humans, explicitly, as participants in his side of the dispute. And he began, from Babylon, to prepare for a confrontation in which his human forces would fight alongside his family forces against the human forces of his rivals, backed by their family forces. The 10th battle, when it broke out, was therefore not the kind of engagement any of the previous 9 had been. It was a hybrid war. It involved family units. It involved human armies. It involved technologies at 3 different levels, from the family's most advanced systems down to the humans' most primitive weapons. And it was fought across a theater that covered most of the known world, because Marduk's human networks and his rivals' human networks had, by the time the fighting broke out, spread far beyond their original centers. The initial engagements were in the corridor, as they had been in the 7th battle. Marduk's forces, both family and human, moved to secure the same choke points he had held before, and Enlil-Nana's forces moved to break the blockade. But this time, the fighting did not stay in the corridor. It spread. It spread because Marduk's human client populations, once mobilized, could not be easily contained, and because Enlil-Nana's human client populations, once threatened, responded in ways that produced conflict in regions far from the original theater. Within a period the tablets describe as 1 generation, the fighting had spread to the plains of India, to the highlands of Anatolia, to the coastal cities of what would later be called the Levant, and, most consequentially, to Egypt. Egypt is where the 10th battle became something the family had not previously faced. Egypt, at this point in the record, was a territory that had been administered under a joint arrangement, similar to the arrangement that had eventually been imposed on the ice installation. Neither faction held it outright. Both factions had followers within it. And both factions had, over the preceding centuries, allowed their followers within Egypt substantial independence, because Egypt was distant from both primary seats and because the joint arrangement had, until now, held. When the 10th battle spread to Egypt, the joint arrangement collapsed. Marduk's Egyptian followers turned on Enlil-Nana's Egyptian followers. Enlil-Nana's Egyptian followers responded. The Egyptian human population, caught between the two, split along lines that had nothing to do with the humans' own local politics and everything to do with which family faction their local leaders had aligned with. Egypt burned. The Egyptian phase of the 10th battle produced the destruction that later Egyptian tradition preserved as the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and it produced the mass migrations that later scholarship would attribute to climate change and internal instability. Those factors were present, but they were not the primary drivers. The primary driver was that the family's civil war had, for the first time in the sequence, produced a proxy war on the surface, and Egypt was one of the theaters of that proxy war. The Egyptian phase escalated. It escalated in a direction the family had, since the 5th battle, sworn to avoid. Marduk, faced with the failure of his ground forces to overcome the joint Enlil-Nana resistance, began to consider the use of weapons his father Enki had, more than once, told him would never be released again. The 7 that split, the weapons that had destroyed the twin cities, the weapons whose fallout had killed the humans of Sumer in the weeks after that destruction. Those weapons were, in principle, still sealed, but their seals had, since Anne's withdrawal, no ultimate custodian. The council had inherited custody, and the council was now at war with itself. Marduk did not, so far as the record shows, actually deploy any of the 7. What he did, which was almost as consequential, was to threaten to deploy them. He communicated to Enlil, through an intermediary, that if the joint arrangement in Egypt was not dissolved in his favor, he would consider himself authorized to break the seal on at least one of the 7 weapons and to use it against a target of his choosing. He did not specify the target. That was part of the pressure. Any of the seats, any of the cities, any of the installations. All were, in principle, in range. Enlil, receiving the threat, understood that Marduk had crossed a threshold from which the family could not return. Because whether or not Marduk actually intended to break the seal, the fact that he had threatened it in writing, in a message that was preserved and that would be read by every senior officer in every faction, meant that the norm against the 7 had been broken. The threat itself was, in the family's own reckoning, an act sufficient to justify a preemptive response, and Enlil authorized that response. The preemptive response was not, itself, the deployment of the 7. Enlil was not willing to be the first to break that seal. What he authorized was the preemptive neutralization of Marduk's capacity to break it. This meant identifying the specific weapons Marduk was in a position to access, moving to secure them, and, if necessary, engaging Marduk's forces at the specific sites where those weapons were stored. It was, in effect, a nuclear counterproliferation operation conducted between 2 branches of the same family over weapons that had been jointly held for what the tablets describe as an age. The operation was partially successful. 3 of the 7 were secured by Enlil's forces before Marduk could reach them. 2 were destroyed in the fighting, damaged beyond the ability of either side to use them. 1 was reported as unaccounted for, its location no longer certain, and this weapon, in the tablet's own account, is described as remaining unaccounted for at the time the tablets were sealed. And 1, the 7th, was, according to the tablets, taken by Marduk. Marduk had it. Marduk held it. And Marduk, from that point on, was in a position to use it if he chose. He did not use it. That is the strange and haunting fact at the heart of the 10th battle. Marduk did not use the 7th weapon. He had it. He could have. He had, by his own written statement, threatened to. But when the moment came, he did not. And no one, in the tablets or in the modern commentary, can fully explain why. Some fragments suggest that Enki, his father, personally intervened and persuaded him that use of the weapon would end the family's presence on the planet not just for him but for everyone, and that his own descendants and his own client populations would perish along with everyone else. Some fragments suggest that Marduk was told, by some source not identified in the surviving material, that use of the weapon would trigger a response from somewhere off the planet, from the home itself, that neither Marduk nor anyone else on the surface would survive. And some fragments simply say that Marduk, having contemplated the deployment, decided that he would not do it and provide no reason for the decision. Whatever the cause, the weapon was not used. And the 10th battle, having reached its highest point of escalation, did not resolve. It settled. Settled is the word the tablets use, and it is important to understand exactly what they mean by it. They do not mean that the fighting stopped. They mean that the fighting entered a mode where it could not be brought to a formal conclusion. Because to bring it to a conclusion, both sides would have had to agree on terms. And the terms could not be agreed. Marduk would not surrender his seat. Enlil would not accept his continued authority. The two factions were locked in a position where each held the other's ability to close the conflict, and neither was willing to give up that hold. So the fighting continued, at reduced intensity, in scattered engagements across the surface. And the terms of resolution were, by mutual and unstated agreement, deferred. Deferred to when? The tablets do not say. They say only that the family, in its senior councils, agreed that certain issues would be revisited at a future point that had not been specified. The revisit would be triggered, according to the fragments, by a set of conditions. The conditions are given only obliquely, and they have been the subject of scholarly argument for more than a century. But the general shape of them, drawn from the various fragments that survive, is this. There would come a moment when the humans reached a threshold of technological capability. There would come a moment when the humans, having reached that threshold, began to look outward from the planet. There would come a moment when the humans began to encounter, or to reconstruct, the family's own technology. And when those three conditions coincided, the deferred issues would be revisited. The 10th battle would, formally, resume. And the settlement, which had held, would be reopened. This is why the 10th battle is called unfinished. It was not concluded. It was paused. And the pause was defined, in the family's own terms, as a condition, not as a duration. The pause would hold until the conditions triggered its end. When the conditions triggered its end, the pause would end. The humans, of course, did not know any of this. The humans, in the aftermath of the events described, saw only the surface consequences. They saw the collapses. They saw the migrations. They saw the fall of Sumer, and the rise of Babylon, and the fall of Babylon, and the rise of subsequent civilizations that inherited fragments of the family's records without understanding what those fragments described. Each subsequent civilization built its own religious framework on top of the fragments. Each religious framework interpreted the family's members as gods, and their disputes as cosmic dramas, and their weapons as divine judgments. The specific technical content of the record was steadily lost. What survived was the narrative shell, and the narrative shell, over the millennia, drifted so far from its original meaning that even the scholars who preserved it eventually forgot what it had originally been. The family, meanwhile, withdrew. They did not leave the planet. That is the crucial distinction. They withdrew from active management. They withdrew from the visible administration of human affairs. They withdrew, in most cases, from the surface. But they did not depart. They remained in installations that had been prepared for exactly this contingency, in the deep and under the ice, and beneath certain deserts, and, according to some of the more speculative fragments, in what would now be called seabed installations along the mid-ocean ridges. They remained. They watched. They waited for the conditions. There is no evidence, in any tablet I have been able to identify, that they have subsequently withdrawn completely. There is substantial evidence, in the form of physical signatures at certain sites, that at least some of their installations remain operational. The tablets themselves specify, with unusual precision, the number of installations that were placed into what they call the long wait, and the number is given as 97. 97 sites, distributed across the planet, prepared for a wait of unspecified duration. Some of those sites have been located by researchers whose work has not been widely disseminated. Some have not, and some, according to one of the more disturbing fragments, are located under sites that are today occupied by human infrastructure, in cities whose current inhabitants have no idea what is buried beneath them. The conditions for the resumption of the 10th battle, meanwhile, have been ticking down. We have, in the past 2 centuries, crossed the technological threshold the tablets appear to specify. The Industrial Revolution, the 20th century, the digital era, all of these are, in one plausible reading, the humans arriving at the capability the family said they were waiting for. The humans have, in the past 70 years, begun to look outward from the planet in the specific sense the tablets appear to describe. We have satellites. We have probes on other bodies. We have, in a limited but real sense, begun the reconstruction of certain family technologies, though we do not think of them that way, and the tablets say that when the three conditions coincide, the deferred issues will be revisited. Are the conditions coinciding now? I cannot tell you that with certainty. No one can. What I can tell you is that if the tablets are read as an operational record rather than as mythology, then the current human moment is, at minimum, one that would have registered on the family's own indicators. And if it has registered, and if the pause has been governed by the conditions the tablets describe, then the pause has, in some sense that we would not immediately recognize from the surface, ended, or is ending, or is about to end. The tablets do not offer a specific date. They offer a description of a state, and the state, so far as I can determine, describes the world we are currently living in. That is Battle 10. That is why it is not over. That is why the record ends where it ends, without a resolution, because the resolution has not yet occurred. And that is why the sequence of 10 battles that we have followed tonight, from the first Sky War, through the destruction of the Twin Cities, through the 7 that split and the confinement of Marduk, and the succession of Nana, is not, in any meaningful sense, a closed sequence. The 10th item on the list is open. Everything before it was preparation. And what comes next is something that neither the humans nor the family have, at any prior point in the record, ever fully agreed on the terms of. And so we come to the end of the sequence. 10 battles, 10 records. One family, fractured across generations, fighting over a planet that they had, at various points, claimed, shaped, contested, damaged, and, in the end, could not agree on what to do with. If you have followed the sequence from the beginning, you will have noticed something that the individual battles do not, on their own, quite reveal, but that the sequence as a whole makes unmistakable. The pattern of the 10 battles is the pattern of a family that could not solve its own succession problem, and that turned every disagreement into a conflict, and that made every conflict a little larger than the one before it, until the last conflict was one that neither side could bring themselves to formally close. That is not a divine story. That is a family story. It is the kind of story that plays out, at smaller scale, in every family that has ever fought over an inheritance. What makes this family's story different is that the inheritance was a planet, and the weapons available for the fighting were weapons that could kill populations. And the humans who lived under the fighting were, for most of the sequence, not participants but bystanders. The bystanders became participants only in the 10th battle. And once they became participants, the character of the entire enterprise changed, and the family's ability to manage the situation ended. I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming. As we close this record, I am not claiming that everything in the tablets is literally true. I am claiming that the tablets are older than the religious traditions that built on top of them, and that they describe events with a specificity that is difficult to explain if they are pure invention, and that the pattern they describe, of a technologically advanced family with internal disputes and periodic uses of force, is consistent with itself across many independent fragments that were compiled by scribes who could not have coordinated their fictions. Something happened. Whether it happened exactly as the tablets describe, we cannot say. But something happened, and the something that happened shaped the world we inherited. Sit with that thought for a moment. You inherited a world that was shaped by events you were not told about. You inherited institutions, boundaries, mythologies, prohibitions, all of which had, at some earlier point, a rational operational basis that has since been lost. The prohibition on certain foods, the taboo around certain places, the persistent religious idea that certain locations are sacred, that certain buildings should not be entered, that certain knowledge should not be sought. None of these arose from nothing. They arose from something. The something has, in most cases, been forgotten. The prohibitions remain. We follow them, or we break them, without ever knowing what they were originally protecting us from. The tablets, if you read them with an operational eye, give you access to a portion of the something. You can begin to see, dimly, why certain sites are sacred. Because they were installations. You can begin to see why certain foods were forbidden, because they carried, or were associated with, contamination from one of the battles. You can begin to see why certain regions are haunted, in the folkloric sense, because they were battlefields, and the battlefields carried physical signatures, and the physical signatures produced anomalies in the human experience that the humans, unable to explain them technically, encoded as ghost stories. None of this is comforting. I want to be honest about that. If you have been listening for the past 3 hours in the hope of hearing a story that resolved into meaning, into wisdom, into a lesson that the humans could take forward and use, I do not have such a story to offer you. The tablets do not offer such a story. The tablets are a record. They describe events. They do not moralize. They tell you what happened, and they leave you to draw your own conclusions. The conclusions that I have drawn, and that I offer you not as truth but as one reader's interpretation, are these. First, that the humans have consistently underestimated the extent to which their own history has been shaped by decisions made by entities other than themselves. This is not a claim about ongoing manipulation. It is a claim about legacy. The humans of Sumer did not build their civilization from scratch. They received it, in fragments, from a family that was ending its own active presence. The humans of every subsequent civilization built on those fragments, without knowing where the fragments had come from. And the humans of the present day inherit the accumulated legacy, likewise without knowing. Second, that the 10th battle is not over. I have made this claim several times over the past 3 hours. I make it again now, at the end, because it is the claim that most directly bears on the present. The tablets describe a pause. The pause was governed by conditions. The conditions appear to be being met, in our era, in ways that the tablets could not have specified in advance, but that the tablets did, in general terms, anticipate. If the pause ends, what follows is not, in the family's own reckoning, a new beginning. It is the resumption of an interrupted engagement. It is the continuation of a fight whose terms were not resolved. Third, that the humans are, for the first time in the sequence, in a position to influence the outcome. This is the point that the tablets do not directly make, but that a careful reading suggests. During the previous 9 battles, the humans were essentially spectators. During the 10th battle, they became proxies. In whatever comes next, they may become principals, because the humans, having developed their own technology and their own institutions, are no longer purely dependent on family instruction. They have, in a limited but real sense, become capable of making decisions about their own future without waiting for family approval. Whether they will use that capacity wisely is not something the tablets can tell us. But the capacity exists, and the tablets acknowledge, obliquely, that the family did not fully anticipate it. These conclusions are, I stress, tentative. Other readers of the same material have drawn different conclusions. Some have concluded that the family is entirely fictional and that the tablets are a mythology whose meaning is purely symbolic. Others have concluded that the family is real but has fully departed, and that whatever installations remain are dormant and will remain so. Others have concluded that the family is real and present and actively influencing events, and that everything happening in the current era is being managed by hands that most humans cannot see. I do not endorse any of these positions to the exclusion of the others. What I have tried to do, in the previous 3 hours, is to present the record as it actually reads, without imposing on it a conclusion it does not itself support. Do with that what you will. Let me walk back through the 10 one more time, in the closing form the scribes themselves used. Not in the narrative form we followed at the beginning of each battle, in a shorter form, a reminder form, so that when you close this account and return to whatever you were doing before you found it, you carry the shape of the sequence with you, and the shape is the thing that matters most. Battle 1 was the first Sky War. 2 brothers, 1 installation, 1 father who barely got there in time. It happened above the atmosphere, over an installation the tablets call Anna. It ended with a truce that neither brother believed in, and with a class of weapons locked away that would remain locked for a very long time. What it established, and what echoes through everything after, is that the family had, at its highest level, no reliable mechanism for resolving disputes about inheritance. The mechanism they used, the father's ruling, only worked as long as the father was there, and even then, it did not really resolve. It only postponed. Battle 2 was the weapon over Eridu. It was the moment Enlil demonstrated that he was willing to use force against a human population in a First Brother's territory. It did not kill many people, in the family's own accounting. In the humans' accounting, the ones who were killed were everyone, and the survivors, who had their memory of the demonstration erased, went on with their lives unaware that they had been the target of an operation. That is a detail worth remembering. The humans, at various points in the sequence, were operated upon without their knowledge, and the operations included the erasure of the memory of the operations. What was done to Eridu could have been done to any of us. If the record shows one thing clearly, it shows that memory itself, at the level of an entire population, was a variable that the family was willing to manipulate. Battle 3 was the Siege of the Underworld Gate. Slower, longer. Fought not with weapons but with agents at checkpoints. Over the course of many generations, it ended with Ereshkigal, who had held the Deep as an independent branch of the family, effectively neutralized. Her authority was folded into a joint arrangement that steadily eroded her position, and by the end of the third battle, she had become the silent figure who sits in her chamber and does not speak. That is a sobering outcome. It shows that the family's approach to internal reform was not always violent. Sometimes it was administrative. Sometimes the target of the reform did not fully understand what was happening until it was too late to resist. And the resulting figure, sidelined and silent, is the figure that later human traditions turned into a queen of death, without knowing that she had once been the ranking authority of an entire operational branch and had been maneuvered out of that position by a slow campaign that used her own family's rules against her. Battle 4 was the War of the Watchers, the security force that went rogue, the transfer of knowledge that could not be recovered. This is the battle whose traces are most vivid in the surviving human traditions, because the Watchers' fall was the story most consistently preserved across the greatest number of cultures. The Book of Enoch preserved it. Genesis preserved a version of it. Various apocryphal texts preserved fragments. Even certain non-Semitic traditions have echoes. What they all agree on is that a group of celestial beings descended, took human women, taught them things they should not have been taught, and were punished for it. What the Sumerian record adds, and what the later traditions largely lost, is that the punishment was not a divine judgment. It was a military police operation. The Watchers were arrested. They were tried. They were, in most cases, killed or confined. And their offspring, the Nephilim, were dealt with by a mechanism the tablets do not fully describe, but that clearly involved their elimination as a lineage. Battle 5 was the destruction of the Twin Cities, the one that left evidence you can walk to. The isotopes are still in the soil, the plain is still empty, and the plume that killed Sumer, that killed the family's own primary human population, is a detail that the biblical tradition does not preserve, because the biblical tradition was compiled by heirs of one particular subpopulation that was not, in the family's factional politics, primarily aligned with Sumer. The heirs of Sumer, who would have preserved the plume in their own tradition, were the ones who died in the plume. Their memory of it, when it survived at all, survived in fragmented and demoralized forms, and it eventually faded. So the fifth battle is preserved in the record as a story about two cities and a wife who look back, and the larger fact that the same weapon system that destroyed those cities also destroyed the family's own capital region and killed the family's own workforce is a fact that survives only in the tablets themselves. Battle 6 was the silent war in the ice, the manipulation of the climate installation, the slow cold that followed, the famines that killed off entire regional populations, and, at its deepest level, the demonstration that a technical system could be turned against the population it had been built to serve, and that the population would experience the results as weather and would never know that the weather had been made. This is the battle that most closely rhymes with certain modern anxieties. Though I raise the rhyme carefully, I am not claiming that current climate events are being manipulated. I am claiming that the tablets describe, in unambiguous language, a case in which climate was manipulated, and I am noting that the possibility of such manipulation is not, in the tablet's own reckoning, a possibility that has been eliminated from the current world. Battle 7 was the Battle of the Salt Sea, the corridor, the blockade, the first time the family had fought on and over water, the stalemate that ended in a partition, the creation of Marduk's seat, which was the third pole in a system that had been binary, and the recognition, quietly noted in the record, that a triangular system is inherently less stable than a binary one, and that the partition was, in the family's own understanding, a solution that guaranteed further conflict. If you take one lesson from the seventh battle, take that one. The solutions that end battles are not always solutions that end wars. Sometimes the solution is a new configuration that guarantees the war continues, at reduced intensity, indefinitely. That is what happened after the seventh, and that is what has, in a certain sense, been continuing since. Battle 8 was the war beneath the sand, the launch, Marduk's seizure, Ninurta's assault, the confinement in the pyramid. What the eighth battle demonstrated is that no facility, however protected, was safe from a determined move by a faction that considered itself wronged. The launch had been the family's most protected asset. It had been protected by the shared interest of all factions in its continued function. That protection failed. Someone was willing to risk the loss of the launch itself in order to seize control of it. And though the launch was, in the end, recovered without permanent damage, the norm against attacking it had been broken, and the norm could not be restored. Every subsequent facility, every subsequent installation, every subsequent asset the family possessed was now, in principle, a potential target. And that awareness, more than any single tactical consequence of the Eighth Battle, changed how the family thought about its own security. Battle 9 was the Battle of the Broken Sky, the Succession, the Vote, Zu's theft of the Tablet of Destinies, and Ninurta's recovery of it, the installation of Nana in the senior seat, and Marduk's permanent exclusion from that seat. What the Ninth Battle demonstrated, in retrospect, is that even a successful transition, one that was concluded by a vote and installed a legitimate authority, could not eliminate the resentments that had been created by the sequence of prior battles. Marduk lost the Ninth. He accepted the loss. But he did not, and could not, accept it as final. And the resentments he carried out of the Ninth Battle were the resentments that produced the 10th. If the family had, in the Ninth, found a way to bring Marduk into the succession on terms he could accept, the 10th would not have happened. They did not find such a way, and the 10th is the consequence. And Battle 10. The 10th is the one we are still inside, the hybrid war, the human proxies, the threat of the 7 that split, the weapon that Marduk took but did not use, the pause that followed, defined by conditions rather than duration, and the 97 installations still, according to the tablets, in the long wait, distributed across the planet, dormant but not decommissioned, waiting for the conditions to be met. The tablets say the conditions are 3: technological threshold, outward-looking, reconstruction of family technology. The tablets do not say the conditions have been met, but they do not say they have not been met, and a careful reading, applied to the current human era, does not rule out that they are being met right now. That is the 10 in short form. That is the sequence the scribes wanted the humans to remember, and that the loss of the records over the succeeding millennia has largely erased from the general memory. What you have heard tonight is a reconstruction. It is a partial reconstruction. It draws on fragments that survive in different collections, and it fills gaps with the reasoning that seems most consistent with the surviving material, and it presents the whole in a form that would have been familiar to any Sumerian scribe of the Middle Period, though the specific interpretation would not have been theirs. The scribes had their own interpretations. Some of them are preserved. Most of them are not. What I have offered you tonight is one modern reconstruction of the record. Others exist. Yours may, in time, differ from mine. But whatever your own reading turns out to be, when you have read the material for yourself, I hope you will carry forward at least this. The tablets exist. They describe a sequence. The sequence describes 10 battles, and the 10th of the 10 is not, in the record's own accounting, closed. There is a habit, in the study of ancient records, of treating them as if their principal value is what they tell us about the past. That is a serious habit, and it has produced serious scholarship, and I do not want to dismiss it. But when you spend enough time with the Sumerian tablets specifically, you begin to notice something that pure, past-oriented reading tends to miss. The scribes who compiled these records were not, in most cases, writing them down for us. They were writing them down for someone. That someone was, in the strict sense, their own posterity. But their posterity in the sense that they conceived it was not identical with our posterity as we conceive it. They believed that the records they were preserving would be needed, at some future point, by people who would face situations that resembled the situations described in the records. The records were a manual. They were preserved because their content would, at some future point, be operationally relevant. If you accept even the possibility that the scribes were correct about this, then reading the record becomes a different kind of activity than most academic reading. It becomes something closer to studying a manual for a machine you have not yet been told is in your possession. You read for pattern. You read for signature. You read for the details that seem, on the surface, to be minor, because those details might turn out to be the critical ones. And you read, above all, with the awareness that the writer of the manual believed the manual would eventually be used. I have tried, in the past 3 hours, to read the 10-battle sequence in that mode, not as literature, not purely as mythology, as a record whose original writers believed it would eventually be operationally relevant. Whether they were correct in that belief is not something I can settle for you tonight, but I can say that a manual mode reading of the tablets produces a coherent picture, and a coherent picture is not what pure mythology tends to produce. Pure mythology, when you push it into operational reading, breaks down. It contradicts itself. It resists systematic interpretation. The tablets do not do this. The tablets, when you push them into operational reading, hold together. And that, to me, is one of the strongest arguments for taking them more seriously than they are typically taken. Now let me speak, for a moment, about the specific implications of the 10th battle being still open. If the 10th battle is still open, in the sense the tablets describe, then the humans have, at some point in their future, a decision to make that they have not yet fully faced. The decision is not whether to fight. That framing misses the shape of the situation. The decision is whether to remain proxies or to become principals. Because as long as the humans are proxies, they are participants in a fight whose terms were set before they existed and whose outcomes they cannot substantially influence. As principals, they would be participants in a fight whose terms they had, to some degree, negotiated, and whose outcomes they could substantially shape. The transition from proxy to principal is not a transition of increased power. Not exactly. It is a transition of increased responsibility. And it requires, as its precondition, a level of self-awareness that the humans, throughout the recorded portion of the sequence, have not consistently displayed. Whether they can develop that self-awareness in time is, I would argue, the single most important question of the current era. Every other question, every debate we are currently having about our institutions and our technologies and our future is downstream of that question. Because if the humans transition to principles, then the specific content of the transition will depend on which of our current institutions and technologies and futures we carry into it. If we transition without the self-awareness, we transition as proxies. And the fight, whose terms were set by the family before we existed, will be the fight we have to fight without the ability to renegotiate the terms. I do not know if we will develop the self-awareness. I do not know if the humans, taken collectively, are capable of it. The record suggests, gently, that we have not yet fully developed it in any previous era, and that we have had, at various points, opportunities to develop it that we did not seize. But the record also suggests that the family, in withdrawing rather than departing, left open the possibility that the humans might develop it later. If they had considered the humans incapable, they would have withdrawn further. They would have taken their installations with them. They did not. Which means, at minimum, that the family, in whatever council they held at the moment of their withdrawal, did not entirely give up on us. The long wait is not a wait for us to fail. It is a wait for the conditions. And the conditions, as I read them, include the possibility of our success. Here is what I would ask you to hold, in the days and weeks after you finish this account. Hold the sequence. Hold the 10. Hold, especially, the fact that the 10th is open. And when you encounter, in your own reading and your own experience, details about the current era that do not seem to fit the standard explanations, hold those details up against the sequence and see if they fit better there. Sometimes they will. Sometimes they will not. When they do, take note. When they do not, take note of that too. The record is not a checklist. It is a background. Against the background, some things become visible that were not visible against the ordinary background of contemporary discourse. The sites are still there. The installations, if they exist as the tablets describe, are still in the deep and under the ice and beneath the deserts. The weapons, or such of them as were not accounted for, are still wherever they were placed. The Tablet of Destinies, so far as the record shows, was recovered and then, at some later point, transferred to a location the tablets do not identify. The seventh weapon, which Marduk took and did not use, was, according to one fragment, hidden by him in a place he did not disclose to anyone else, so that if he ever chose to use it, only he would know where to retrieve it from. Whether that hiding place has ever been found is a question the record does not answer. Some of the modern speculation on the point is lurid and unsupported. Some of it is more sober. None of it, so far as I can tell, has produced a verifiable location. The weapon, if it exists as the tablets describe, remains where Marduk left it. This is the world you live in. This is the physical geography beneath the political geography, beneath the cultural geography, beneath the personal geography that you experience day to day. The layers stack. Each layer has its own laws, its own histories, its own patterns of stability and disruption. Most of us live our lives entirely in the top layers and never look down. The Sumerian scribes, when they wrote the tablets, were looking down. They were trying to describe what was under the surface. They understood that the surface was, in a certain sense, provisional, and that the deeper layers would eventually become relevant again, and that when they did, the humans of that future era would need the record to make sense of what was happening. We may be that future era. I cannot tell you with certainty, but the possibility is not, on any careful reading of the record, absurd. And the possibility, if you take it seriously, changes your relationship to the small events of your daily life. It suggests that there is a larger frame within which your daily life is embedded. It suggests that certain of the anxieties that seem individual are actually collective. It suggests that certain of the patterns that seem random are actually structural. And it suggests, most importantly, that the humans have work to do that they have not, so far, been fully aware of doing. If you want to help, in whatever small way, do this. Learn the sequence. Carry it with you. When you encounter, in whatever form, evidence that is consistent with the sequence, note the evidence. When you encounter people who have been thinking along similar lines, listen to them. When you encounter people who have not been thinking along these lines, do not lecture them, but do not dismiss the possibility that they too, in their own way, will come to something like these conclusions. The knowledge is being redistributed. It is being redistributed slowly and in fragments, and often through channels that the traditional institutions do not recognize. It is being redistributed, in some sense, on schedule. The tablets, in their oblique way, anticipated this. They said the record would be reassembled when the humans were ready. The reassembly is happening. You are a participant in the reassembly, whether you intended to be or not, simply by having listened this far. That is the shape of the situation as I understand it. That is the reading I can offer you. It is not the only reading. It is not necessarily the right reading. But it is a reading that, when I hold it up against the material, produces a coherent picture. And coherence is not, in this domain, something to be taken for granted. The 10 battles fought over Earth, read in order. The 10th one is still open. The pause is defined by conditions, and the conditions appear to be being met. The installations are still there. The weapons, or some of them, are still there. The family, or such of them as remained after the withdrawal, are, so far as the record suggests, still there. And the humans, at long last, are approaching the threshold at which their participation becomes a matter of decision rather than of accident. I do not know what you will do with any of this. I do not know what any of us will do with any of it. But I do know that a record that describes 10 battles, and describes the 10th as unfinished, and describes the unfinished 10th as governed by conditions that appear to be present in the current era, is a record worth carrying in the back of one's mind, and worth returning to when one encounters events that do not otherwise fit into a comprehensible frame. The frame may not be comforting, but comfort was not what the scribes were offering. What they were offering was the sequence. What they were offering was the record. What they were offering was, in effect, a warning that came bundled with a hope, and the hope was that the humans, when they eventually got to this point, would be ready. Let me end where the scribes tended to end their own longer accounts. Not with a summation, not with a moral, with a formula. A closing that acknowledges that the record continues past the point where the account ends. The battles were 10, the record was made, the tablets were sealed, and the sequence, from the first Sky War, through the destruction of the Twin Cities, through the confinement of Marduk, through the succession of Nana, through the unresolved 10th, was placed in the keeping of those who would come after. That keeping is now yours. What you do with it is up to you. Turn the record over in your mind. Let the sequence rest. And if, at some future point, you find yourself in a situation that seems to echo one of the 10, and you find yourself reaching for the pattern, remember that the pattern was preserved for exactly that use. You are not the first to face it. You will not be the last. But you are, in the specific position you now occupy, one of the humans to whom the record was, in the deepest sense, addressed. The 10th battle continues. The record is with you. And that is where we leave it. For tonight, and for whatever comes next. Take a slow breath, if you have been listening intently. The material we have covered has weight, and it is not a weight that lifts quickly. If you are listening at night, in the dark, in a room where the only illumination is the screen you have been staring at for the past 3 hours, let your eyes rest for a moment. The record has been in the ground for 4,000 years and change. It will still be there in an hour, or a day, or a week. If you need to return to it, it is not going anywhere. There is a question that people ask when they have followed the sequence for as long as we have followed it tonight. The question is, what should we do? The question is understandable, and it is well-intentioned. And it is, I have come to believe, the wrong question. It is the wrong question because it assumes that the appropriate response to a record of this magnitude is an action. The appropriate response is not, in the first instance, an action. It is a recalibration. It is a slow adjustment of one's own understanding of the world, so that the world one is acting in is closer to the world as the record describes it, rather than the world as one had been assuming it to be. Once that recalibration has occurred, actions will follow, and the actions will be different from the actions one would have taken before. But the actions are downstream. The recalibration is the primary work. I want to describe, in a little more detail, what that recalibration might involve. Not because I want to prescribe it. I do not think it can be prescribed. It has to be arrived at by each person, at their own pace, from their own starting point. But I can describe what it has looked like in my own case, and in the cases of others who have spent time with this material. It might, at least, give you a marker. The first shift is a shift in one's sense of the age of things. When you read the tablets seriously, you begin to understand that the human present is a very thin layer on top of a very deep past. The past is not, as the standard historical narrative tends to suggest, a series of ever more primitive stages leading up to the current sophistication. The past is, in the tablets account, a series of high points and collapses, with the current era being one high point among many, and not obviously the highest. This shift in one's sense of time is disorienting at first, but it settles, over time, into a kind of humility that I have found to be productive. You are less inclined to believe that your era is uniquely capable, or uniquely doomed, or uniquely anything. You are more inclined to see it as one moment in a longer sequence, and to act with the awareness that other moments have preceded it and other moments will follow. The second shift is a shift in one's sense of the sources of change. When you read the tablets, you begin to understand that many of the changes that ordinary history attributes to human agency have deeper roots than human agency alone can account for. This is not a determinism. It is not a claim that humans do not act, or that human action does not matter. It is a claim that the framework within which humans act was, at various points, established by decisions and events that the humans themselves were not the primary drivers of. This shift is uncomfortable for people who are attached to a strong narrative of human self-determination. But it is not, in my experience, a shift that eliminates human agency. It relocates human agency from the primary cause of everything to one of several causes operating within a larger frame. The relocation is, again, humbling, but it also, in a certain sense, liberating, because it removes from the individual human the burden of believing that everything is their responsibility. It distributes the responsibility across a wider set of actors, and it opens the possibility that the humans, collectively, might participate in the frame rather than being wholly captured by it. The third shift is a shift in one's sense of what constitutes evidence. When you read the tablets, you begin to notice that the categories of evidence that ordinary historical inquiry accepts are narrower than they need to be. Ordinary inquiry accepts written records, archaeological remains, and confirmed physical dating. The tablets, when read carefully, invite you to also consider oral traditions preserved across many cultures, patterns of taboo and ritual that seem to encode operational information, geological anomalies at sites that ancient texts identify as significant, and the strange fact that certain physical evidence exists that mainstream frameworks cannot easily explain. This is not, in my reading, an invitation to abandon rigor. It is an invitation to expand the range of what counts as data, while continuing to apply rigor to the data one has expanded to include. Some readers, hearing this, immediately go too far in the direction of accepting anything. That is not what I mean. I mean expand the range with continued discrimination. Not everything is evidence, but more things are evidence than the standard frameworks allow. If you make those three shifts, or something like them, you will find yourself reading the world differently than you did before. Not necessarily better, not necessarily more accurately, but differently. And the difference will, over time, accumulate into a perspective that is closer to the perspective the scribes had when they compiled the record. That perspective is, in my experience, both more sobering and more grounded than the perspective one starts from. You see more of the frame, you are less surprised by the events within it, and you find, in the long run, that certain problems that seemed insoluble in the smaller frame become, if not soluble, at least addressable, once you can see them at the scale they actually operate on. These are, I emphasize again, my own reflections. I do not offer them as the correct interpretation of the material. I offer them as one reader's honest report, after enough time with the record that a report seems appropriate. Now, before I stop entirely, one more thought about the specific figures we have followed tonight. Anne, the father. He is the figure who defined the entire sequence by his presence in the first battles and by his absence in the later ones. His withdrawal, more than any single event, changed the character of what came after. And yet, we know almost nothing about him. The tablets describe his rulings. They describe his weight in the councils. They do not describe him as a personality. He is a function more than a character, which may be, in the family's own reckoning, what a senior authority is meant to be. A person whose specific personality has been effaced in favor of the office they hold. If that is the case, then Anne is, in the deepest sense, the most difficult figure to grasp in the entire record, because he is the one who has most fully become the position he occupied. Enlil, the commander, the eldest son by birth. He is, in some ways, the most human of the family figures, because his impulses are the most legible. He wanted authority. He wanted control. He wanted to be right. He wanted his brother to be wrong. And when he could not get those things by argument, he was, more than once, willing to use force to get them. He is not sympathetic, in most readings, but he is comprehensible. And his comprehensibility, more than any of the others' actions, is what makes the record readable as a family story rather than a divine one. Divine actors do not have petty motives. Enlil does, which is one of the reasons I do not believe he was divine. Enki, the engineer, the second son by birth, the elder by lineage of the mother, the one who designed the humans, who defended the humans, who filed complaints on the humans' behalf, even when doing so damaged his own position within the family. He is, in most readings, the figure most sympathetic to us, because he is the figure who most consistently acted in our interest. Whether he acted in our interest for our sake, or for his own sake, or for some combination of the two, is a question the record does not fully answer. What is clear is that his interest and ours aligned for most of the sequence, and that his defeats within the family were, indirectly, defeats for us. Marduk, the ambitious son, the seat-taker who never took the seat. He is, in most readings, the most difficult figure to place morally. On one reading, he is a villain, a striver whose ambition drove the family to the brink and left the 10th battle unfinished. On another reading, he is a reformer whose vision of transferring authority to the humans, though self-serving, was in fact the correct vision for the era, and whose failure to achieve it was a failure of the senior authorities to recognize what was necessary. I do not know which reading is correct. Both are supported by the record. It may be that both are correct in different measures, and that Marduk was, like most historical figures of that scale, a mixture of the villain and the reformer, and that his ultimate significance is more accurately assessed as ambiguous than as either wholly negative or wholly positive. Ninhursag, the mother figure, the one who midwifed the humans and then, at a critical moment, voted for the destruction of the twin cities and then, after the fallout, could not bear what she had done and withdrew. She is one of the most poignant figures in the record, because she is the one who most clearly represents the moral cost of the family's decisions. She was not evil. She did not want the humans to die. And when she saw what her vote had produced, she stopped participating. She did not, so far as we can tell, ever fully re-engage. She emerged, briefly, for the emergency council after the seizure of the launch, but she did not return to active service afterward. She is a figure of grief, and her grief is, in a certain sense, the emotional signature of the whole later part of the sequence. Ereshkigal, the silent one, the queen of the deep, the figure who was maneuvered out of her independence by Enki's slow campaign, and who never spoke again in her own name. Her silence is, in the record, a mystery. We do not know what she was doing, in her deep chamber, during the events of the 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th and 10th battles. The record does not tell us. She may have been simply present, an absent authority who no longer participated but who could not be entirely erased. She may have been doing something else, something the tablets did not know or did not choose to describe. We do not know, but her silence, in a family so full of loud voices, is worth noticing and worth wondering about. These are the figures. There are others, of course, whose names we have used and whose actions we have described. Nana, Utu, Inanna, Nabu, Ninurta, Shamyaza, Azazel, Zu, Kingu. Each of them has their own place in the sequence, and each of them could be discussed at more length than we have room for tonight. What I want you to take away from this brief return to them is that these are individuals, not archetypes, not symbols. Individuals with their own choices and their own resentments and their own capacities and their own failures. The mythology that grew up around them, over the millennia, obscured their individuality. The record, if you read it carefully, restores some of it. And that restoration is, I think, the most valuable thing that a careful reading of the tablets offers. Not a new theology, not a new science, a new set of ancestors, a family of predecessors, complicated and flawed and specific, whose disputes shape the world we now inhabit. When you know them as individuals, you understand yourself differently, because you were, in some sense, made by them. Not only literally, in the case of Enki's engineering of the human line, but historically, in the sense that the events they set in motion produced the civilization that produced you. There is one more area I want to touch on before the very final closing, and it concerns the question of what the humans of the current era actually possess from the record that the humans of prior eras did not. Because if the 10th battle is unfinished, and if the humans are being drawn into it as principals rather than proxies, the specific tools the humans have available at this juncture matter enormously. They are the tools that will determine, in whatever fashion, what the human contribution to the resolution can look like. The first tool the humans of the current era have that prior eras did not is the ability to see themselves at scale. Prior eras could see their village, their region, at most their empire. They could not see the planet as a whole. They could not see the human population as a single connected entity. They could not see, in short, the object that the tablets describe when the tablets speak of the humans as a class. That vision of the human population as a single object with characteristics and trajectories is a vision that has become available only in the last century or so, through a combination of communications, technology, and demographic science, and the physical experience of looking at the planet from above. The humans of the current era can see, for the first time, what the family saw when the family looked at the humans. That is a substantial capability, and it changes what is possible. The second tool the humans of the current era have is the ability to record and transmit at scale. Prior eras had limited memory. Their memory was, mostly, oral, and where written, it was fragile, and where transmitted, it was slow. The current era has memory that is functionally permanent, in the sense that anything committed to certain storage forms can be recovered arbitrarily far in the future, and transmission that is functionally instantaneous across the planet. This capability was, for most of the tablet's time frame, the exclusive possession of the family. The humans did not have it. The humans now have it, in a form that is not identical to the family's version, but that is functionally similar in the specific respects that matter for this discussion. Information can be preserved, information can be shared, and information that has been preserved and shared can, in principle, be used by humans acting collectively across time and space, in ways that no previous human generation has been able to act. The third tool the humans of the current era have is the ability to consciously reconstruct. Prior eras inherited fragments of the family's technology without knowing they were doing so. They developed metallurgy without knowing that metallurgy had first come to them through the Watchers. They developed astronomy without knowing that astronomy had first been a tracking technology for the family's own installations. They developed medicine without knowing that medicine had first been the family's medical branch under Nin Herzog. All of these were reconstructions, but they were unconscious reconstructions. The humans did not know they were rebuilding a body of technique that had pre-existed them. The current era, uniquely, has enough of the record to know. It has enough of the tablets, enough of the parallel traditions, enough of the archaeological and physical evidence to at least suspect what is being rebuilt. Which means that the current era can, in principle, engage in conscious reconstruction, guided by the record rather than stumbling upon it. That is a substantial change in the human situation. These three tools, taken together, give the current human population capabilities that no previous human population has possessed. Whether the current human population will use those capabilities well is, of course, a question that no one can answer in advance. But the capabilities are there. They are ours. They constitute, if the tablets are right about the 10th battle structure, the human contribution to whatever comes next. I have avoided, throughout this account, speculating about what specifically comes next. That is because I do not know. The tablets, as I have said, describe a state rather than a schedule. They describe conditions rather than a date. And any specific speculation about how the state will manifest, or when, would go beyond what the record supports and into the territory of my own imagination, which is not what I have been trying to offer you tonight. What I will say is that whatever comes next will, on any reading consistent with the record, involve the humans more centrally than any of the previous 9 battles did. And that centrality will require the humans to have developed, by then, the capacity to act as principals. If they have not developed it, they will be swept along by whatever the resumption of the 10th produces. If they have developed it, they will have some ability to shape what the resumption produces. That is the difference, in stark terms, between the two possible futures. Which of the two futures we get is not something the tablets can determine, it is something the humans collectively will determine, by the shape of their own preparation. If the current era prepares wisely, using the tools it has, then when the resumption comes, the humans will meet it as capable participants. If the current era does not prepare, or prepares poorly, then when the resumption comes, the humans will meet it as they met the previous 9, which is to say, as bystanders in a fight they did not fully understand, whose consequences fell on them without their consent. The record, in the end, is an offer. It offers the humans of the current era the information they would need in order to prepare wisely. Whether they will use the offer, or set it aside, is not something the record itself can decide. It is something we decide, day by day, in what we choose to attend to and what we choose to ignore. Every attention paid to the record, every mind that carries a piece of the sequence forward, is a small contribution to the collective preparation. Every attention that is diverted, every mind that treats the material as mythology and moves on, is a small subtraction. The sum of the contributions and the subtractions, over time, will determine what the human population of this era brings to the moment of resumption. Let me also note something about the pattern of the 10 battles that becomes visible only when you look at them as a series rather than as individual events. The pattern is that each battle produced a settlement, and each settlement created the conditions for the next battle. This is not accidental, it is structural. The family, throughout the sequence, was operating without a mechanism for the durable resolution of its own core disputes. What it had, in place of such a mechanism, was a series of ad hoc arrangements, each of which stabilized a particular situation while leaving the underlying disagreement unresolved. Battle 1 produced the First Division. The First Division stabilized the immediate crisis but did not address inheritance. Battle 2 occurred because inheritance had not been addressed. Battle 2 produced the amended First Division. The amended First Division stabilized the immediate crisis but did not address the growing capacity of the humans. Battle 3 occurred because the human capacity had not been addressed. And so on, through the sequence. Each settlement was a patch. Each patch held for a while. Each patch eventually failed because the underlying issue it was meant to defer was still present and eventually pushed through. If you take that pattern seriously, then the current pause, following the 10th battle, is itself a patch. It is the current version of the settlement pattern that the family has produced at every prior stage. And like all the previous patches, it is a patch that will eventually fail because the underlying issue, which is now the human question in its most concentrated form, has not been addressed. The pause holds for a while. It has held, in fact, for a considerable while. But the pause will end. The question of what the humans are, and what the family's relationship to them is going to be going forward, has not been answered, and the pause is simply a period during which the answering has been deferred. That framing, once you accept it, changes your understanding of the current era in a fundamental way. It suggests that the current era is not, as many of its own participants believe, a period of relatively stable and progressive human development, but rather a period of deferral during which certain very large questions are being held in abeyance. The stability, on this reading, is not intrinsic. It is the artifact of a specific arrangement that will eventually be revised, and the progressiveness, likewise, is not intrinsic. It is the artifact of the humans developing, uninterrupted, during a period when the family has chosen not to intervene. If the family chooses to intervene again, or if the conditions of the deferral change in ways that terminate the pause, the stability and the progressiveness will both be reassessed under different conditions. None of this is meant to be alarming. I am not, in raising it, trying to induce anxiety. I am, in the honest reading of the record, trying to describe what the record itself describes. The record describes a paused conflict, governed by conditions, in which the humans are one of the parties. The current era is inside that pause. What the humans do inside the pause will affect what happens when the pause ends. That is, on any careful reading, the situation. I have tried to describe it accurately rather than reassuringly, because reassurance was not what the scribes were offering when they preserved the record. What they were offering was information, and information is what I have tried to pass along tonight. You have, tonight, contributed. By listening this far, you have added your attention to the total. That is not nothing. It is not everything, and I do not want to overstate it. But it is a real contribution to a real collective preparation, and I want to acknowledge it and thank you for it before we close. You are, in the deepest sense, a downstream consequence of the 10 battles. Every institution you belong to, every language you speak, every belief that shapes your daily behavior has, at some remove, an ancestor in the events we have described. Some of the ancestries are more direct than others. Some run through Sumer and Babylon and Egypt and the Levant and the Greek and Roman traditions that inherited fragments of the earlier corpus. Some run through the wisdom traditions of India and China, which receive parallel fragments through different channels. Some run through the folk traditions of Northern Europe and Central Asia, which encoded the fragments as heroic and monstrous figures whose original identities had been lost. But somewhere back along your intellectual and cultural lineage, whatever that lineage is, there is a connection to the sequence you have followed tonight. That connection is your inheritance. What you do with it is a question of choice. I want to close with a specific image, because images sometimes carry meaning that argument does not. Imagine yourself walking, at dusk, in a landscape you have known your whole life. The hills you have always known, the roads you have always known, the town in the distance where the lights are just now beginning to come on, everything familiar, everything ordinary. And now imagine that as you walk, the light shifts, and for a moment you can see, faintly, beneath the surface of the landscape, the shape of an older landscape that had been there before. Roads that had once run in different directions. Buildings whose foundations are still there, under the current buildings. A river that had once flowed differently, in a different bed, in a different climate. The old landscape is not gone. It is under the new landscape. And for a moment, in that particular light, you can see it. That, in a certain sense, is what the tablets do. They shift the light, briefly. They let you see, faintly and only very briefly, but with a very specific and unmistakable clarity that ordinary daylight does not permit, the older landscape beneath the current one. The older landscape does not replace the current one. The current one is still real. The hills, the roads, the town, all of it is still there and still yours. But the older landscape is also there, and knowing that it is there changes something about how you walk in the current one. You walk with a different awareness of what is beneath your feet. You walk with a different sense of what your walk connects to. You walk, in a certain sense, differently. That is what I hope the past 3 hours have given you. Not a new belief, not a new certainty, a shift in the light, a brief view of the older landscape, and a sense that when you return to your ordinary walking, in your ordinary landscape, you will be walking with a slightly different awareness of what is beneath. The 10 battles were fought. The 10th is not yet closed. The record was kept. And the record, tonight, has been shared with you. May you carry it well. May you carry it lightly, where lightness serves. May you carry it heavily, where heaviness is required. May you know when to think about it and when to set it aside. May you know when to speak about it and when to remain silent. And may you know, when the moment comes that requires you to know what to do with what you have learned. The record is old. The record was carefully preserved. The record was preserved for you, and now the record is yours. Sleep well, if you are ready to sleep. Rest, if rest is what you need. Return to the sequence when the sequence calls you. And know that the 10th battle, whatever else may be said about it, is not a fight you have to face alone. It is a fight the humans, all of them together, have been drawn into. The others are with you, whether you know them or not. The record connects you. There is one final thing worth naming, and I will name it because leaving it unnamed would feel like a failure of the account. The record we have followed tonight was written down, initially, by scribes who did not know whether their work would survive. They were writing in a period of political instability, in a region that had already suffered multiple invasions, in a language that had already begun to be displaced by other languages. They had reasonable grounds to expect that their tablets would be broken, or lost, or buried under the rubble of a burned city, and that no one would ever again read what they had written. And yet they wrote. They wrote carefully. They wrote as if the record mattered. And they preserved it as best they could in the hope that someone at some future point would find it and read it and understand. That hope has, in a small and specific way, been fulfilled tonight. You have read it, or you have listened to a reconstruction of it, and you have understood, or at least considered, what the scribes were trying to preserve. That is a small victory for a very old effort. It does not resolve the 10th battle. It does not save the world. It does not, in any grand sense, change the course of events. But it does mean that a piece of very careful work, done under difficult conditions, by people who had every reason to believe their work would be lost, was, after all, received. Received by you. Received, at last, by someone who understood at least enough of it to care. That, I think, is the note on which to end. Not on grandeur, not on prediction, on the small, specific fact of a message received. A message that was sent, in the deepest sense, to you. Thank you for listening. And that is, for tonight, all. The 10 battles fought over Earth. Read in order. The 10th one is still open, and now you know why. Take that knowing forward, in whatever way it belongs in your own life. The record was preserved for this exact passage of understanding, from tablet to reader and reader onward. That has always been the point. Now ease, rest,